Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernard, although most people call me Ben, and I grew up in a small rural town in North America where everybody knows each other, and it is for this reason that I'd like to keep the area where I reside a mystery, in case someone I know is listening and this personal story pops out of the bag like a proverbial jack-in-the-box and becomes angredized or something. I promise you the last thing I want is to be the centre of gossip in my small town. It's not a nice feeling to have people whispering about you and pointing behind your back. Even when they do not make it obvious to you, you can rarely sense when you're the subject of gossip, as everybody becomes incredibly quiet when you enter a shop or something. And then you know without a shadow of a doubt that moments earlier they were actually gossiping about you. It happened to our family once when my overweight mother suddenly lost a ton of weight and looked so drawn, pale and emaciated. Invariably, rumours abounded around our small town that my mother was dying of cancer, which wasn't true, of course, but my mother lost all the weight rapidly because her sister, who lived out of state, had been killed in a road traffic accident, and my mother just stopped eating because she was so devastated. I remember how upset the entire family was to have those ugly rumours circulating and being thrown around like a soccer ball in a public stadium, which is why I do tend to keep my mouth shut when it comes to family business and personal affairs, if you get my drift. I live in a rather modern contemporary style home with large panes of seamless glass that overlook exquisite areas of rolling green countryside, rugged mountainous outcrops, exquisite silvery lakes, lily-covered ponds, and acres upon acres of forest that literally stretch back for miles, consisting of oaks, spruces and maple trees, which is an ideal habitat for the indigenous wildlife such as the white-tailed deer. The White House where I live was built in 1997, but the original house prior to this new development actually belonged to my grandfather, and I always believe it was a travesty knocking down the former original traditional 1800s farmhouse to build a more modern architect's creation just to appease my mother. Sorry, Mum, if you're listening, but I don't like your state-of-the-art modern taste. I've never been a fan of modern futuristic architecture because the edges are way too sharp for my liking, and the buildings almost seem cold, clinical and characterless. And as for the interior design, it's a little too austere and office-like in my opinion. My mother would hasten to disagree with me because she adores modern contemporary design, which is why we live in such a monstrous modern box-style home with large open floor plans and spacious entertainment areas with a symmetrical designed back and front yard, where the scattering of fruit trees seem almost too formal for the space, which is seemingly so incongruous and contradictory with the natural curves and artistic marvels of Mother Nature herself. On the subject of Bigfoot, since I was about 14 years old, I've always been a huge Bigfoot fan, but I kept my fascination for the hairy critter pretty much a big secret, as I couldn't face being ridiculed or laughed at, as invariably you always get people who believe that Bigfoot belongs on the pages of pulp fiction or fantasy novels, but I never believed that for a moment. I knew in my gut that the hairy critter was absolutely real, and although he got a negative press, I kind of always rather secretly liked the critter for reasons I cannot explain. My story begins when the coronavirus hit worldwide, and this global pandemic was causing pandemonium and escalating concern about the elderly and physically compromised. My grandfather on my father's side, whom initially owned the former house on our land, was now living in frail care, and at the time one of the residents there had recently died of the coronavirus. When my mother heard about the horrifying news, she insisted my grandfather came to live with us immediately because he had huge issues and complications with his lungs, and so if he caught the virus, my mother was pretty certain he was a goner, so to speak. As a boy growing up, I only ever visited my grandfather a handful of times and got to see him on Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, but until more recently I did not have a close relationship with him. I falsely believed that growing up in a different generation that my grandfather and I were poles apart, with so little in common. I was to realise that this extraordinary wizened old man, with his wrinkled skin and tortoise-like face, with the small brown sparkling eyes, was like a kindred spirit, and we had much more in common than I ever imagined possible. In fact, the irony is that my grandfather is an older, much more wiser version of myself. It was on a late Saturday night when my parents had all retired to bed and my grandfather was watching a programme on television, and I was listening to YouTube Bigfoot stories. My grandfather suddenly glanced up at me curiously and asked me how the strange technology I was using actually worked. You see, my grandfather owned a cell phone and barely knew how to operate it properly because modern technology was a little too overwhelming for him. I began to show him my tablet, and of course he was looking through all my recommended videos, many of them being Bigfoot stories. As my grandfather scrolled through my tablet, he looked up to me with a big, beaming, jubilant smile and pointed to a picture of Bigfoot. "I've seen one of those," he said, as if he was recalling the most wonderful, amazing memory. So this is my grandfather's story, as he told me. As you know, I lived on this property when it was a former 1800s home, before this modern, charmless monstrosity was erected in its place. I lived here with your grandmother and your father, who was a very little boy of about 7 at the time, and his younger brother Aaron. There was a dairy farm not far from here, and I became a milkman in the local area, delivering milk to all the local residents. After a while, the dairy was also offering deliveries of fruit and vegetables to people in the area, so sometimes in the back of my dairy cart there would invariably be a few boxes of fruit and vegetables for local residents. Every morning I'd get up at the crack of dawn at about 3 a.m. to go out on my dairy stint around the local area, and at this time of the morning it was usually dusky, but the winters were the worst here, because the weather was freezing cold, and during these winter days, of course, it was always much darker on those biting blizzard-like mornings. So every single morning I would manoeuvre my little milk cart down some of those rough dirt roads, all the while jingling the milk bottles, and they would wobble precariously in their box containers, making that tinkering sound, which is so reminiscent of milk being delivered. Come rain, shine, hail or snow, I would be out there embracing the harassing, formidable elements, and delivering my milk while the whole world around me was silently fast asleep. Rising out of my bed in the early morning was a struggle, but once I was out there with the cool breeze blowing against my face and the sun beginning to rise over the horizon, dappling the area with an exquisite morning light, which was only enhanced by the beautiful sounds of the dawn chorus, I promise you those were the best times to be up and about, and I enjoyed bustling around delivering the milk to all the locals. One morning when it was still very dark outside in the early hours, I was delivering milk to the front door of the Baker family home, when I heard this very peculiar, strange sound coming from behind one of the bushes in the front yard. It truly sounded like someone was in agonising, tortuous pain. So imagine my horror when I discovered little Tammy Baker, who was no more than 15 at the time, hiding behind the bushes, squatting on the ground and making these groaning whimpers. I noticed that she had a cloth stuffed in her mouth to suppress the noise that she was making, so I rushed over to her and I pulled the gag out of her mouth and asked her what on earth she was doing behind the bushes at this ungodly hour of the morning, and why on earth wasn't she in bed. Suddenly it became all too horrifying clear for me, and very, very surreal, when I realised that little Tammy Baker was actually giving birth to a baby, because she was pushing very hard, and with each push she would hold her breath and cry out in terrible pain, moaning, groaning, gasping and sweating. I was just about to call for help when she begged me not to call her parents, or anybody else for that matter. "Please don't, Bob," she interjected between her puffs and frantic gasps. "If Dad knows about this, he is going to kill me, and I'm not kidding either. He'll throw me out onto the streets and never ever speak to me again. I'll have brought such huge shame on my entire family, and they'll look at me in such disgust and contempt forever. Please, Bob, you can't tell a solitary soul about this, because if you do, my life is forever ruined." "But what about this baby? It needs a mother," I protested. "I'm going to give it up for adoption, Bob. I have to. It's best for the baby. I can't possibly keep it. I'm only 15. I haven't even got a job, and nor have I finished school yet." "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "I've thought about it, Bob, long and hard," she said, "and I can't raise a kid on my own." "Very well," I said. "Your secret's safe with me. So let me help you deliver this baby." "Oh, my God," she cried. "It's coming! Oh, it's coming! Oh, it's coming! Oh, no! Please will you go inside, into the house, Bob, and grab me some towels from the bathroom. Make sure you wake nobody up. Oh, you can't wake up my mum and Dad, because if you do, they'll do their nut. Oh, if they see what's going on here." I obediently crept through the baker's house, terrified that a creak of the floorboards might alert the bakers to my presence, but somehow I managed to grab some towels from the bathroom and a knife from the kitchen. I ran out of the baker's house with a knife and towels, and that was when the head of the baby came sliding through Tammy's legs like a jet plane that was very eager to land. That baby wanted to be born, and it was not going to wait for anybody. I helped Tammy deliver her beautiful baby, and I did the honours of cutting the cord. It was a poignant, magical moment for myself and for Tammy, one that I shall never ever forget. I felt incredibly privileged and honoured to share in this spectacular, intimate moment with her. I obediently crept through the baker's house, terrified that a creak of the floorboards might alert the bakers to my presence, but I managed to grab some towels from the bathroom and a knife from the kitchen. So I ran out of the baker's house with a knife and the towels, and that was when the head of the baby came sliding through Tammy's legs like a jet plane that was very eager to land. The baby wanted to be born, and it wasn't going to wait for anyone. I helped Tammy deliver her beautiful baby, and I cut the cord. It was a poignant, magical moment for myself and Tammy, one I will never forget. I felt privileged and honoured to share in this spectacular, intimate moment with her, especially behind the bush in the yard. I immediately wrapped the beautiful baby in a towel and patted its back hard so that it let out a loud cry. I was so terrified that the cry would wake up the neighbourhood, but luckily no one stirred. I wiped down the baby and handed it back to Tammy, who was bobbing it up and down in her arms and smiling jubilantly. You couldn't wipe the smile off her face, she looked so delighted. "Oh, he's so beautiful," she gasped. "Oh, isn't he beautiful? I so wish I could keep him, but it's not remotely conceivable. I'm way too young to have a baby." I remember I persuaded Tammy to come home with me, and I woke up your grandmother, who has a nursing background, so she knew what needed to be done. She was in her absolute element, bustling around like a clucking mother hen, attending to Tammy's every single need, washing towels and clothes for her, giving her a long soak in a hot bath, and looking after the baby. Your grandmother took care of the baby for Tammy until she was 100% certain that she wanted to put it up for adoption, and then we helped her with the adoption process without her parents ever finding out. Do you really think the parents would have disowned her? Oh, I'm afraid I do. They were very strict, no-nonsense kind of family, and in those days having a baby out of wedlock was very highly frowned upon. Mr. Baker came from a very staunch Irish Catholic background, and he would have been incensed about the birth, and who knows what he would have done. So I'm glad we kept the whole thing secret for Tammy's sake, I must say. How did she manage to hide her pregnancy from her parents? I mean, surely she was showing by then. Well, I imagine she was, but Tammy was very good at dressing in loose clothes if she needed to, so I imagine that's what she did. Did Tammy ever get to see her beautiful baby again? Well, it was actually a very charming story, because Tammy was able to visit her son very regularly while he was growing up, as the adopted family wanted Tammy involved in their son's life. She even became his godmother. It's very unusual for this to happen, but the parents wanted their son to know their other mother, so things worked out exceedingly well. Later on, Tammy went on to have 3 children all of her own, but never lost touch with her beautiful boy, who grew up to be a very fine young man. I gather he was to become a fabulous food critic, writing up about restaurants and so forth all over North America. Wow, what an incredible story, Grandpa! Well, your grandmother played an instrumental role in ensuring things worked out for Tammy, which they did, because imagine if the parents had got involved, things would have turned out really terrible. What about your Bigfoot encounter, I asked. What happened there? Well, sometimes when I was delivering milk, I almost always sensed that I was being stalked, and I felt pretty certain that something or someone was actually watching me, but what I couldn't imagine. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, and so obviously I thought I was going stark raving mad. Was I imagining this? At the time I was delivering fruit and vegetables to some of the locals, and I kept getting complaints that they were not getting their full quota of fruit and vegetables, which became a huge mystery to me. I packed the boxes myself, so I knew that I'd included everything that they'd ordered, so I was actually rather befuddled as to what on earth was going on. People would be missing bags of grapes, bunches of bananas, peaches and fruit that I swore I'd packed, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I felt very muddled and confused. I knew that somewhere on my milk round that someone must be pilfering the fruit order, and so I decided to set up a trap by putting bunches of bananas in a bag with a cat bell attached to it, so that when the perpetrator took the bananas, I would be alerted to the presence of the jingling bell. You see, it was so dark in the mornings, anyone could have raided the vegetable boxes without my knowing about it by stealthily sneaking up to my cart when my back was turned, and it would seem that the thief was a master at not being detected, but who on earth it was, I couldn't imagine at the time. So the very next day, as I was doing my milk rounds, I heard the jingle of the bell, and I immediately lit up the area with my torch, and I nearly dropped my torch in total horror, because I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing. "I take it, Grandpa, you saw Bigfoot," I giggled. "Boy, you must have been freaked out. I wish I'd been there to see your face." "You would be right about that, but at the time I had no idea what it was. All I could think to myself is, what the heck is that? I remember it didn't look like it liked the torchlight at all, and for a moment we just stood staring blankly at each other, hardly daring to believe what we were seeing. I really think the critter was more surprised to have been caught out by me. I think these critters really know how to slip into the shadows and remain undetected, so I think he was pretty surprised to get caught like that." "What did he look like, Grandpa?" "Well, at a guess I would say this thing was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, possibly about 4 foot wide, maybe more or less, was covered in long brown red hair. I do remember thinking that this creature was very giant-like, and it was built like a truck. It was solid, sturdy, burly, and exceedingly strong and powerful. I could see that in an instant. It had very long arms, hectically big shoulders, and a cone-shaped head. It was human and yet not human, and it was ape and yet not ape, if you get my drift." "Wow! Was it aggressive, Grandpa?" "No, funnily enough, not at all. Just very surprised to have been observed, I think, by me. It was also a little bit impressed, I think, that I caught it out," chuckled my grandfather. "I don't know why, but I sensed that. It seemed to have a sense of humour, because I could swear it was having a chuckle to himself. I could be wrong, of course, but that's what I sensed. After the critter turned around, and the way he moved, it was with such a seamless grace. You should have seen it. He was so fast, and he was so agile and so athletic and lofty and majestic. Oh, my word, I was in total awe watching this thing moving back into the woods. I've never seen anything like it before. I was just absolutely gobsmacked. I would bring a box of fruit for the critter every single day, and I would just leave the box in the middle of the road, piled with bananas and fruit of every kind, and I would do this every day without fail. And this creature, he would dash into the middle of the road and grab the box, and then he was gone, and he always knew that I'd left it for him. Sometimes it would leave me strange presents from the earth, like feathers and stones and stuff like that, and then he would put them into the road and point to them, and then he was gone. It was wonderful. I just loved seeing him every single morning. He was the highlight of my day. One day it actually brought a sweet little Bigfoot to come and get the fruit with him. The little critter was about 3 foot tall, and it dived into the bananas at once with huge exuberant enthusiasm and gusto, eating them with the skin and still intact. I remember it watched me with these wide, curious, inquisitive eyes because it was so fascinated by me. And I got the sense that the big Bigfoot was literally introducing me to the little one, almost as if he was showing off his sprog to me like a very proud father. It was really very endearing, and I have to tell you that little Bigfoots are adorable because they have the most inquisitive, curious nature, and I rarely have to tell you they're naturally comical without even trying to be. One day the creature came and collected the box, and he left me a huge pair of antlers in the middle of the road for me. Very impressive they were. And then he pointed into the far distance, and I sensed that the Bigfoot was trying to tell me that he was moving on and saying goodbye. It turned out I was right in my assumption, because when I put the box in the middle of the road the following day, he never got it, and nor the day after that, or the day after that. That was when I began to realise that the creature had definitely moved on, and I was devastated. I was gutted and so depressed, because I had warmed so much to the Bigfoot, and after that experience, I have to tell you, the milk round was never quite the same again. I want to tell you something for nothing. I missed that big, hairy critter. It really was such a likeable character, with a huge, warm, engaging sense of humour, and not an ounce of malice in its entire body. I've no doubt in my mind that these creatures would help you in a heartbeat if you got caught up in a precarious situation. However, I'm quite sure there are others out there that may not be quite so nice. Grandpa, I said, hugging him tightly, that is the most beautiful story I've ever heard. I could see my grandfather was choking up with tears, so I was in no doubt that this Bigfoot had impacted his life in a very powerful, poignant way. As I live in the same location where my grandfather first encountered the Bigfoot, I keep hoping and praying that one of these Bigfoots or one of the offspring will cross my path one day, and if it happens, you and your listeners will be the very first to hear about it. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I have to say, Bernard, you're going to have to tell your grandfather that I am so thrilled to have, heard this incredible story. And thank you so very much for sharing it with us, because it really was quite a beautiful story. And I do love the way the Bigfoot actually stole the fruit from the back of the milk cart. And what a great idea, putting a cat bell on the bananas so that you caught the creature, who was clearly very impressed to be caught by humans, because they probably think they have the last laugh with us. They think they're too clever to get caught by us. So when they do, they find it very, very surprising. But another thing that just blew my mind was your story about, the poor young girl, Tammy Baker, giving birth behind a bush. And that you helped her and that your wife helped her, and you managed to keep this a secret from the parents of Tammy Baker, who would have taken it very, very badly if they had discovered that their 15-year-old daughter had given birth, which is terribly sad because they never got to know their grandson. But, that's what it was like in those days. And I actually heard a story from someone once who told me that they had a friend who was, this was in England, and this friend was in Ireland, and her parents were very, very strict in those days. I think it must have been in the early 80s or something, I was told that the story happened. And apparently this girl was so terrified of her parents because they were so strict. And, she was literally terrified. So she literally made an excuse and literally took the ferry over to England and got a legal abortion, because she was she knew her life wouldn't be worth living if, they found out about the pregnancy. So I don't know if you know of any stories like that, because definitely if you do, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear them.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, 62-year-old Dr. Van Niesen didn't look up from his computer when mother and daughter entered his very neat, well-ordered office that consisted of a single walnut desk with only a computer on it for company, along with a photograph of a woman standing next to two adult children, smiling warmly into the camera. They were likely the doctor's wife and children. There was a wall covered with an impressive collection of framed certificates, and a long sideboard consisting of drawers that probably contained a plethora of medical stuff. Yvette did not like doctors at all. She'd always had a huge aversion to them since she was a little girl, when her mother had dragged her, kicking and screaming, to get vaccinated here at the surgery. She had not been to this place for many years. The whole place had undergone a miraculous makeover, so that the surgery bore no similarity to the dingy, rather run-down doctor's offices she had visited all those years ago. At the time, the makeshift doctor's rooms had been scruffy with very basic furnishings, which included steel tables and chairs, and a run-down filing cabinet. But now everything looked a lot more upmarket and sophisticated, like a photograph that is transformed from the mediocre to the glossy. So the place bore no relationship to what Yvette had remembered as a child. Even the reception area looked like it had been plucked out of the latest edition of Hello magazine, with large vases tumbling over with flowers, wrought iron and glass coffee tables, covered with the latest editions in upmarket magazines, and sumptuously cosy leather couches, along with a selection of Van Gogh-style watercolours on the walls. As a girl, Yvette had abhorred the sight of blood and a needle being injected through her skin. It had always made her faint. Dr. Van Niesen had told her the injection would never hurt her, but to her it always did. Twice she'd actually passed out in front of the doctor after she'd been jabbed. "Honestly, Yvette," her mother would say, "it's a needle, for goodness sake. It's not going to kill you. Anyone would think you'd been physically mauled and attacked by a wild animal, or something equally as bad. I didn't raise you to be such a wimp." At the time, Dr. Van Niesen, who had been a whole lot younger back then, had laughed and said, "I've had worse, Mrs. Wiseman. Believe me, I've had worse." "I find that very hard to believe, Dr. Van Niesen," her mother had said. "I just think you're being awfully nice." "It hurts," Yvette had told her mother, who had rolled her eyes at the back of her head in exasperation. "Why are you so squeamish, love? It makes no sense. Of course it doesn't hurt, Yvette. It's all in your head." "But I hate the sight of blood, Mummy. I really hate it. It makes me feel faint." Yvette's mother had believed her daughter was being overly dramatic, but those tormenting memories of being poked and prodded at every doctor's appointment as a girl had left behind their indelible scars that for Yvette could not be easily wiped away. As a consequence, Yvette's opinions of doctors were not exactly good. She believed doctors needed to be avoided at all costs, unless your life was in serious jeopardy, of course. She held a similar viewpoint of dentists and anyone else in the medical profession for that matter. When her daughter Riley was born, she had never accompanied her daughter for her childhood vaccines, because of her own traumatic memories of those inauspicious doctor's appointments. She had recruited her sister Leslie to do the dirty deed for her instead, and take little Riley to the surgery herself. Leslie had whisked Riley off to all her doctor's appointments, but when her daughter had returned from her vaccinations, she was as cool as a cucumber, as if nothing untoward had happened to her. Yvette had been more than a little bewildered. She had emphatically believed her little girl would have been disturbed by being prodded by a needle, but it would seem that little Riley didn't even bat an eyelash. "See, I told you it would be fine," her sister had told her. "Riley was an absolute trooper. Even when the doctor gave her an injection, she didn't wince once. She doesn't have a ridiculous aversion to needles like you do, Yvette. The doctor gave her a once-over and a marshmallow mouse, and she was as happy as Larry." It had taken Yvette all the courage she could muster to drag her daughter Riley along to the surgery this morning. But sometimes you had to do what needed to be done, even if you were loath to do it, but you did it to be a responsible mother. Dr. Van Niesen had changed a lot since Yvette had last seen him, when she was a girl. She had always come to the surgery on the insistence of her overzealous mother, who brought her to Dr. Van Niesen at the first sign of a stomachache, or even a hint of a cough. Yvette doubted Dr. Van Niesen would remember her, but she could recall him very clearly.
She tried to wipe away the tormenting memories of him slamming a needle into her arm when he was removing blood for a test or giving her a standard vaccination. She had to admit that Dr. Van Niesen looked good for a man of his years. Although his crop of brown hair had taken a significant beating by the hands of time, as much of its thickness had disappeared, his hair was now rather thin, and he had a receding hairline, as well as a prominent bald patch on the top of his head. But in a strange way the look rather suited him, gave him character, she thought. He had kind eyes, the colour of dirty ice, a blue-grey crystal sort of colour, you could say, framed by distinctive round glasses that rather reminded Yvette of something Harry Potter would likely wear. Dr. Van Niesen was smartly attired, wearing an expensive pinstripe shirt and a rather flashy colourful tie. He was still as slim as a reed. When she had visited him as a girl, he'd always worn a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck, but not this time. Times had certainly changed since then. Dr. Van Niesen cleared his throat. He gestured for both mother and daughter to take a seat on what looked like to be very smart leather chairs. "It's Yvette Wiseman, is that right?" he asked, looking up from his computer directly at Yvette. "And this is your daughter?" "Yes, this is my daughter Riley. She's 7 years old." "Ah, here we are. I see, Miss Wiseman. You've not been at the surgery for a long, long time," he said, looking directly at her. "I thought you looked vaguely familiar. I remember you coming here with your mother when you were a wee girl. That was quite a long time ago. I seem to remember you were terrified of needles. You didn't like coming here very much, did you? Your mother was very vigilant about bringing you to the surgery for your regular checkups, which you never appreciated." Yvette flushed, feeling the colour creeping up her cheeks. She hoped his last comment wasn't a dig. "That's right, Doctor. You've got quite a good memory. Nothing's changed. I'm still terrified of needles." She didn't add that she included doctors in that reference. The doctor chuckled. "Well, you're not alone, Miss Wiseman. A lot of people are afraid of needles. Your daughter Riley has been brought to the surgery by your sister Leslie from time to time. Is that right, for vaccinations and checkups, I see?" "That's right, Doctor. I just don't like watching anyone being injected. I'm squeamish. That's why I get Leslie to bring her." Dr. Van Niesen nodded, as if he understood. "Is your address the same as the one your sister Leslie gave us for your residential location, Miss Wiseman? Your trailer is 27 at the Col de Claire Trailer Park. Is that right? It's not far from here. It's quite a rural location, off the beaten track, shall we say. Nice place to live. The location, I mean," he said rather diplomatically. Yvette inwardly winced. She knew very well how unglamorous the trailer park was. But the doctor was right. One thing she couldn't complain about was living in such an idyllic part of the world, with mountain trails and wood groves teeming with wildlife. "That's right, Doctor." Dr. Van Niesen began to tap away on his computer, and then he looked up at Yvette with a quizzical expression on his face. She couldn't believe he recognized her from all those years back. But then again it was hard to forget a patient who collapses on the floor after they've had a needle inserted into their arm. The memory continued to make Yvette flush with embarrassment, with the heat now physically rising from her chest, upper arms and face. Her mother was right. She could be such a drama queen, and she had left the surgery howling back then, like a wild animal that had been seriously injured. She couldn't help it. She had a low pain threshold, and the sight of the injection had burned her for days afterwards, although nobody believed her about that. Once again her mother had said it was all in her head, and Yvette was loath to admit that her mother was probably right. Growing up she had learnt that her mother was right about most things. "So what can I do for you, Miss Wiseman? It is Miss Wiseman, isn't it? You're not married, are you?" he asked. "I know some of my patients don't appreciate being called Miss, if they're married." "That's right, Doctor. I'm Miss Wiseman. I'm not married." The doctor raised a brow. His eyes were kind. "How can I help you, Miss Wiseman?" "It's my daughter Riley," said Yvette gingerly. She paused for a brief moment, took in a deep breath and said, "My daughter's teacher, Julia Harris,
Insisted we came to see you. That's why I'm here." "I see," said the doctor. What Yvette failed to tell Dr. Van Niesen was the teacher had done more than that. She had threatened to report Yvette to the social services if her daughter did not see a doctor at once. Yvette shuddered inwardly as she recalled her less than amicable rendezvous with the no-nonsense, rather belligerent teacher, who'd waved a warning finger at her and practically had the audacity to call her a deadbeat mother. That teacher had come to the trailer park, located her trailer, and paid her a personal visit on her private turf. "What kind of a mother are you, Miss Wiseman?" she had chided. "Your daughter Riley needs serious help. We are all extremely concerned about her condition here at Jubilee. Your daughter fails to interact in classes with both children and teachers. She's become increasingly subdued of late. Things are getting progressively worse for her. She is distracted and caught up in her own world, and her failure to interact is deeply concerning. You have not done a damn thing about her condition. During classes she gives us a nod for yes and a shake of her head for no, but beyond that we don't get a peep out of her. Your daughter, Miss Wiseman, used to be the class clown, but now she's fading away before our very eyes into obscurity. And this is most unlike the feisty little girl that first arrived at Jubilee. There's something going on with her. It needs investigation. You have not taken your parental responsibilities seriously enough, I'm afraid. If you don't take Riley to the doctor at once, I will be forced to call social services immediately. I'm sorry, Miss Wiseman. I don't mean to issue threats to you, but your daughter's well-being is my prerogative as her teacher." "But you can't do that, Mrs. Harris. That's not right," Yvette had almost bleated. "My daughter's going to be just fine. She doesn't need a doctor. I'm sure she'll come right." "That's where I disagree with you, Miss Wiseman. Her condition has gone on for long enough, and is a cause of great concern among the teachers at the school. This problem needs addressing immediately. We do not know if it's psychological or physical, but she needs to see a doctor at once." "Ah, so the teacher encouraged you to come here. Is that right, Miss Wiseman?" said Dr. Van Niesen, giving her a sympathetic look, almost as if he sensed that she had been bullied to come here, probably against her will, like when she'd been dragged to the surgery as a little girl to have her vaccinations. There was no doubt that doctors definitely had patient types, Yvette secretly suspected. Those that were so paranoid they virtually visited the doctor every week at the first sign of an ailment that they could not diagnose, where they probably thought they were dying of cancer or had developed a rare deadly brain tumour, when they discovered their symptoms uncannily matched Mr. Google. Those were the hypochondriacs, who were usually healthy, but always looking to find something that proved that they weren't. Then there were the regulars who liked to visit the doctor for general overviews of their health, like taking your car to have its annual service, to make sure it still runs on full steam. Then there were those who only visited the doctor when they were sick. Then you had the very infrequent patients, those who had to be practically dying before they visited a doctor. Those, much like herself, who had a distinct aversion of doctors and would avoid seeing them at all costs. It would seem that Dr. Van Niesen recognized that Yvette Wiseman needed to be handled with care, like a fragile piece of porcelain china that was so delicate it could break in your hands. She was the evasive patient type, the type that were as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel, that you rarely got to see, as visits from people like Yvette Wiseman were as rare as a sighting of a leopard in the wilds of Africa, where it is claimed sightings of these cats are few and far between, and if you do get to see one on a wildlife safari, you're considered especially lucky. That's right, Doctor. So what is the problem with Riley? Riley hasn't been speaking, Doctor. The doctor's eyes flickered over to the 7-year-old girl. He gave her a friendly wink and a smile, and then returned his gaze directly to Yvette. I see. So Riley has not been speaking. That's right, Doctor. How long has this been going on for? It's been about a month, Yvette lied, not wanting to admit it had been closer to 2. It had been 2 months of silence, where her daughter Riley had not uttered a single word. "A month," said Dr. Van Neeson, looking somewhat nonplussed. His steady gaze returned to the little girl, sitting stoically next to her mother. She appeared to be staring vacantly into space, almost as if she was completely disconnected from her own body, and was hundreds of miles away. Her vacant look had not gone unnoticed by Dr. Van Neeson. At Yvette's startling revelation, the doctor frowned. His expression registered grave concern, and behind his warm veneer she could see the faint hint of distrust dapple his face, which he tried to conceal well. "Does your daughter have any other symptoms, Miss Wiseman?" Yvette shook her head vigorously. "She's absolutely fine, Doctor. She eats, watches television, does her homework. Everything else is perfectly normal. The teacher says she's not paying attention in class and she seems to daydream a lot. But the big problem concerning the school is that she hasn't spoken at all, and she used to be the life and soul of the party, so to speak." The doctor wheeled up his chair, drawing Riley towards him. He massaged her throat. "Open your mouth, Riley," he said. "Let's see what's going on in here, shall we?" He inserted an ice pop stick at the back of her throat and took a long, hard look into the little girl's mouth with a torch. Riley stared up at the doctor through wide eyes. She looked like a rabbit that had been caught in a cage and wasn't amused to have instruments flung down her throat like this. "Does it hurt when I press your throat over here?" asked the doctor. Riley shook her head. "What about over here?" She shook her head again. "And how about over here?" Once again, Riley shook her head. Yvette interceded on her daughter's behalf. "Riley's absolutely fine, Dr. Van Neeson," she said almost indignantly. "If anything were hurting her, Doctor, I promise you I'd have brought her here straight away. Despite what her teacher, Julia Harris, might say at Jubilee, I'd have brought her here a long time ago if that were the case. Like I told you, my daughter can't talk. I think she's decided not to speak. And that's her choice, isn't it, Doctor? No one should force her to do what she doesn't want to do. It's a free world, isn't it, Dr. Van Neeson?" "Well," said Dr. Van Neeson, "if she's not talking, Miss Wiseman, after being the so-called life and soul of the party at her school, that is troubling indeed. Your daughter appears to have undergone a complete personality change. I don't see any signs of physical trauma here. The airwaves are clear. I don't see any growths of any kind obstructing the back of the throat." When the doctor said this, Yvette's skin began to crawl. Was the doctor talking about cancer, she wondered? Did he really mean to say tumours rather than growths? Cancer was an ugly word, and she didn't want it to be connected to her 7-year-old daughter in any way. Dr. Van Neeson's ominous words gave Yvette pause for some rather unsettling thoughts that she certainly did not want to be entertaining. Could it be her daughter's inability to speak was not just a decision on Riley's part, but connected to some underlying insidious disease that had stolen her voice away? The idea had never occurred to Yvette until now, and the thought filled her with grievous horror. She found her legs spontaneously trembling beneath her, as the jarring thought of Riley having cancer just did not bear thinking about. What if Riley's enigmatic condition was a physical illness that she'd failed to address? Maybe then her daughter's teacher, Julia Harris from Jubilee, was right, and she was a useless mother after all. Please God, she thought, may Riley be all right. "I think, Miss Wiseman, we may be dealing with something psychological here," said Dr. Van Neeson. "Can you think of anything, Miss Wiseman, that could make your daughter react in this way? I am talking about an upsetting, stressful event, perhaps, that might have brought this all on." Yvette shook her head. "No," she lied. "I can't think of anything at all, Doctor. Nothing comes to mind." The doctor lowered his gaze and did not maintain any eye contact with Yvette. "I appreciate, Miss Wiseman, that some things are difficult to discuss and to talk about. But this is your little girl we are talking about. We need to get to the bottom of this mystery, to find answers we seek to explain your daughter's symptoms. From what I can glean at this stage of the game, once, of course, we can rule out any other physical issues, that might have brought this condition on. I'm inclined to believe your daughter has been through a traumatic event, and trauma can do bad things to our mental well-being, Miss Wiseman. Children are impressionable, but I'm sure you know that well."
Yvette said nothing but pressed her lips tightly together, while inwardly Dr. Finneyson's words were making her recoil as she thought about the very thing that had happened, that she believed emphatically had brought all this stress on for her daughter Riley. But this was not something she would be willing to share with a living soul, let alone Dr. Finneyson. If she was to tell the doctor of such things, he'd probably believe she belonged on a funny farm. No, it was much better to appear ignorant, and hope the doctor would find a solution to make her daughter talk again. Was there not some kind of medicine that Riley could take, to calm her down perhaps, and therefore aid in her recovery? Dr. Finneyson continued. He cleared his throat, which he seemed to do rather regularly.
"So you say, Miss Wiseman, you live in a trailer home at the Col de Clare trailer park. I know it very well. I go past that way every day."
"That's right, Dr. Finneyson. That's where I live."
"Well, could you tell me what are your living relationships like? Is Riley's father around, perhaps? Or is there another man in your life?"
Yvette felt annoyed. She lifted up her chin, and her defiant eyes locked with Dr. Finneyson's. She felt affronted about him asking her personal details about her life. He was here to diagnose her daughter's condition, wasn't he? And what he could do about it, not to ask her about whether she was shacked up with a man or not. As far as Yvette was concerned, this was none of Dr. Finneyson's business. She gritted her teeth together.
"What has this got to do with my daughter's condition, Dr. Finneyson? My living arrangements are personal, and I'd appreciate you not asking me personal questions, because they have nothing to do with you. I came here for Riley's sake. As you can appreciate, I certainly didn't expect to be interrogated about whether her dad is on the scene or not." "Miss Wiseman, please don't take offence,"
said Dr. Finneyson, waving a hand to subdue the heated tension in the surgery, caused by Yvette's obvious indignation.
"I need to ask these uncomfortable personal questions, Miss Wiseman. It's not easy to ask them. It may seem intrusive of me, but I'm sure you are as eager as I am to get to the bottom of this mystery as to why your daughter Riley is refusing to talk. I cannot help, nor can I get to the bottom of this conundrum without asking some rather impertinent questions, I'm afraid, that might appear rude on the surface. I do not believe Riley had a stroke at her young age, or any kind of growth that would result in this condition. I believe Riley has been traumatized by something. So the reason I'm asking you these questions about the men in your life is I'm inclined to think that there is a distinct possibility that something or even someone has caused your daughter distress. And my impression is that it could be some kind of emotional trauma that your daughter may have sustained, with or without your knowledge. Once, of course, we have ruled everything else out, but this is where my opinion is leaning, Miss Wiseman."
"I don't live with anyone, Dr. Finneyson. For your information, I did live with a guy about 2 months back. He was a trucker and moved in with me, but he wasn't around very much. He's out of the picture now for good. I can assure you, if you're suggesting he was violent towards my daughter, or something like that, you're wrong. I'm very protective of Riley, Dr. Finneyson. I would never leave anyone around her who had a predisposition to violence. I can assure you of that. I'm a responsible mother, and Riley has always been my top priority. I know she really liked my ex-boyfriend, and he would never ever have hurt her."
"I see,"
said Dr. Finneyson, giving Yvette the once-over, almost as if he sensed she might be hiding something. But if he thought this was the case, he said nothing.
"Of course it goes without saying, Miss Wiseman, I will refer your daughter Riley to an EMT specialist, in case something physical is going on here that I haven't seen."
Yvette nodded.
The doctor continued. "If Riley is deliberately choosing not to talk, Miss Wiseman, this is something that is known as selected mutism. It happens in young children when they've been exposed to trauma. So I need to ask the awkward questions again, Miss Wiseman. I would like you to think long and hard about this. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help in any way I can. Think about it for a moment, Miss Wiseman. Has Riley at any stage seen any form of violence in or around her home?"
"Of course not, Dr. Finneason. I keep telling you that," said Yvette defensively. "I don't know what you're implying, Doctor, but since Riley was born, I've only had 2 boyfriends. None of them would have ever laid a hand on Riley, and I can promise you of that."
"What about you, Miss Wiseman? Have you ever been, a little aggressive towards your daughter? In the heat of the moment, perhaps? Parents can do things sometimes when they're under stress. Lash out when they don't mean to. I imagine it's very hard being a single mother, raising a daughter on your own."
"I can't believe you would even suggest that, Dr. Finneason. I'm shocked. I would never lay a hand on Riley. I haven't touched her since she was born. Never even given her a slap. The only kind of touch I give my daughter are hugs and kisses. Nothing else. I would never ever hurt my daughter."
"Miss Wiseman, this is not about you. I'm not trying to pick at you or implicate you in anything. It's my job to ask these questions, and that's all I'm doing. What about the Cold-declared trailer park where you live? How many trailers are in that park?"
"You do ask some funny questions, Dr. Finneason. I don't know. At a guess, I'd say between 40 or 50, perhaps. But our trailer's not next to any of the others. It's very private. It's situated opposite a field of ponies on the left-hand side, and directly opposite a wood grove that stretches back for many miles. The land is actually owned by a man who owns the trailer park, who's got all kinds of businesses on the go. I paid him extra for our trailer to be completely private. I don't want to be living on top of the other people. The arrangement works well. My daughter regularly goes in the field to feed the ponies, although that part of the property belongs to a rancher, I believe."
"I see. Have you seen any violence among the people living at the Cold-declared trailer park? I mean, could your daughter have witnessed something first-hand, perhaps?"
"Well, there's been arguments, rowdy fighting, a bit of drinking. You do get some rough types living in a trailer park, Doctor. I'm sure you know that. I admit it's not the best place to raise a kid. I'm well aware of that. I wish we could live somewhere else, but I can't afford to. I give Riley the best life I possibly can, Dr. Finneason. Our trailer is really beautiful on the inside and outside, thanks to my sister Leslie. She renovated it for us, so it's really stunning. I assure you nothing has happened among the residents in our trailer park to warrant my daughter not speaking. Nothing that I can pinpoint, unless she was eyewitness to something that I do not know about, which I admit is a possibility."
"What sort of event, Miss Wiseman, may your daughter have witnessed?"
asked Dr. Finneason soberly. "Well, there's all sorts of stuff going on in the trailer homes, Doctor. There's a man in one of the trailers. His name is Ivan Rawlings. I know for a fact he beats his wife up. I've heard her screams and seen her emerge from the trailer with black eyes and stuff like that. But I don't personally think Riley has witnessed any of this first-hand, although it's not impossible that she might have seen something untoward happening that I just don't know about."
Dr. Finneason probably thought she was an irresponsible mother, exposing her daughter Riley to a seedy way of life, where Riley witnessed her smoking spiffs, snorting cocaine and drinking heavily. Yvette could not blame Dr. Finneason for thinking this, but she did none of these things. However, she was all too well aware that this kind of untoward activity did occur regularly in the trailers. Even in the dumpster she found used needles, mountains of beer cans, bottles of spirits, and she'd seen the entrails of spiffs, so she knew what went on at the trailer park. She was very well aware of it all. Even to look at, Yvette had almost certainly seen better and happier days herself. These days she couldn't afford beauty treatments, hair appointments, visits to nail salons, memberships to gyms. Her appearance reflected her hard life. She bit her nails nervously down to the skin. Her body was ever so slightly emaciated, like someone who hadn't enjoyed a hearty meal for quite a while, as Yvette never ate very much. Whenever she caught sight of her sorry reflection in the long mirror in the ladies' powder room at the Gourmet Gallery, where she'd give herself a brief once-over, she was unable to recognize the scrawly creature in the mirror.
Her home-dyed peroxide blonde flyaway hair looked rather thin and lacked lustre. How different she thought she'd look with a bit of expensive pampering. It was easy to look good if you had money at your disposal. But Yvette's money was always in short supply. One minute it was in her hand, the next it seemed to have all but gone. Yvette knew only too well how tough life in a trailer park could be, and how many people tried to escape their financial misfortunes and accumulating hardships by using drugs or drinking themselves senseless to escape the hard brutality of their lives. But having said that, she also well knew that even rich, well-to-do people did that. There was a wealthy family whose daughter was in Riley's class at school, and although loaded, the mother was a raging alcoholic. Yvette could almost sense that Dr. Finneason was typecasting her unfairly, automatically assuming that she was a deadbeat, insouciant mother, based on where she lived and how she presented herself to the world. If she had arrived at the doctor's office sporting a fancy outfit instead of wearing a scruffy pair of jeans and claiming to live at a better address, she was quite certain he'd have had a higher opinion of her. She took offence to this, as Yvette emphatically believed she was a good mother. Well, at least she knew she was the best mother she could possibly be in her current circumstances, where she lavished on her daughter Riley much love and attention, helped her dutifully with her schoolwork, encouraging her in any way she possibly could. She tried to give Riley a healthy diet and took her to interesting places over the weekends. Yvette was a single, hard-working mother, raising little Riley all on her own. She had done her damnedest to give her daughter the best upbringing possible, and everything had been going swimmingly until Riley had stopped speaking, and the incident appeared to have set the cat among the pigeons. And now she had teachers from Jubilee breathing down her neck, demanding answers, and she was made to feel as if she was in some way responsible for Riley's inability to speak. She knew that the authorities always blamed the mother if the child was having problems, and for a moment she felt as if she was in the dock at the courtroom, having to defend her integrity as a mother, and she took issue with this. Life had been a roller coaster ride for Yvette. She had grown up with her younger sister Leslie, where they were raised in their grandmother's 4-bedroom bungalow. Yvette's mother Maisley had never known who her father was, and had clandestinely given birth to her in the upstairs bathroom, on the black and white porcelain tiled floors, in the early hours of the morning, with both her parents blindly oblivious that their daughter was in fact pregnant. Yvette had been born on June the 6th at 5:05 in the morning. Her mother Maisley had been 17 years old at the time, and had not understood what was happening to her body after her waters broke, and she began to experience the most painful contractions, until her agonizing, uninhibited yelps had alerted her mother onto the scene. And when her mother realized in horror that her daughter was having a baby, an ambulance was called at once, but it was too late. By the time the EMTs had arrived on the scene, Yvette had decided to be born. She was waiting for no one. 2 years later, her sister Leslie was also born, with father also unknown. When Yvette's mother was a young teenager, she had gone to lots of parties and got so inebriated that she had no memory of those events. So to discover that she had been pregnant and had been caught off guard twice, with 2 pregnancies behind her, the sober reality had dawned on her that drinking was not her friend. Her parents had insisted on putting her on birth control pills, realizing their wild, out-of-control teenager was having fleeting encounters with young men while 2 sheets to the wind, so they needed to take careful precautions to ensure that it never happened again. They blamed themselves for spoiling their daughter rotten and not raising her with a proper structure and discipline. Yvette's mother had let her own parents raise her children, as being a mother was of no interest to her at such a young age, when she preferred to be fooling around with her teenage friends. Yvette's grandparents had been insistent that their beloved grandchildren had a very good life, so the 2 children had wanted for nothing. They were well fed and pampered by their grandparents, raised in a solid, very happy home, where their mother had become more like a sibling in their lives. As a result, Yvette and her sister Leslie had gone to very good schools, courtesy of their generous self-sacrificial grandparents. Yvette's younger sister Leslie had excelled in all her subjects at school, but by contrast she had not been academically successful, and so her less than satisfactory grades meant she couldn't go to college or university, which meant she was out on a limb as to what to do with her life. These days Yvette's mother Maisley lived in Denver. She was happily settled down and married to a man called Ralph Atkins, whom had swept her off her feet. By the sounds of things they were smitten by each other. Yvette had envied her rather bohemian mother, and her incredible relationship with her man, wondering whether her mother's good fortune in the love department might actually catch up with her one day. It would seem it was never too late to find love. That was what her mother would tell her consistently. Yvette and her sister Leslie had remained behind in their sleepy rural Colorado town, from where they'd grown up as children, while many of their peers had long since left the town to pursue their careers. Some had been eager to leave, as if they couldn't get away fast enough to embrace brand new beginnings and experiences. In many ways Yvette had felt as if she'd been left behind, like an autumn leaf on the wind that remains resolutely stuck under a tree in one place, and even when the winds roar and advance, the leaf just fails to fly away. Yvette's sister Leslie was very happily married, much like their mother Maisley was. She had a 2-year-old toddler. She didn't live too far away from the Col de Clare trailer park, so the sisters met up regularly for lunch. Leslie would have liked very much for Yvette to move in with them. She was fortunate to live in a very attractive, well-to-do old Victorian property in an up-and-coming Colorado neighborhood. The sisters remained very close, but Leslie's husband, who everybody called Walrus, had given his wife a stern ultimatum. "It's your sister or me. You choose," he had warned. "I know you and your sister are practically joined at the hip, but I don't want anybody else living with our family. Nor do I want your sister Yvette sponging off us. Do you understand? Don't get me wrong, I like Yvette very much. She's a very nice lady. And Riley is a cute little child. And yes, I am sorry for their current financial circumstances, but we're not responsible for them in any way."
Walrus, don't be so unreasonable. It can't be easy bringing up your child at the Col de Clare trailer park. Some of the characters living there are unsavoury, you know that's true. I worry about little Riley being exposed to that kind of thing. It could have long-lasting implications on her mental well-being. You know kids, they're so impressionable.
"That's not our problem. I'm sorry, Leslie, but it isn't. Your sister is living where she's living because she's chosen that life for herself. She should have applied herself better when she was at school like you did all those years ago. Your grandparents sent you to great schools, you know they did. Your sister had every opportunity to improve her lot in life, but she didn't. Look at you, you sailed through school, made something of yourself. Your sister should have followed your inspirational lead. You're the younger sister, for goodness sake, but she was the one that flunked everything."
That's not fair, Rolf. Not everybody is academic, you know. Yvette really tried hard when she was at school. And I mean really tried hard. I hardly think that's her fault that she flunked her grades. She wasn't good at academic subjects, but she was a brilliant dancer, you know. You should have seen her on stage. She was incredible.
Ralph raised a sceptical brow. "Dancing," he scoffed. "Where's that going to get you? Your sister tried hard, did she? Then she got knocked up at 18 with that boyfriend of hers, who couldn't even be bothered to hang around for the birth of her baby. I'm sorry, Leslie, but she brought this all on herself. We create our own lives. If Yvette's facing a struggle, she's going to have to learn to rise above it herself, don't you think? Who said life was ever easy? We all have our own challenges we have to face."
"I think you're being unkind, Walrus. I really do."
"You can say what you like, love, but this sister of yours, Yvette, is never moving in with us. And I repeat, never. We have a toddler now that needs our undivided attention. We will also be having more children, And we don't need outside interferences dragging us down, especially not your sister of all people."
Leslie had reluctantly relented. She knew there was no talking walrus around. The man was mulishly stubborn, and when he doggedly put his foot down about something, that was it. In the end she had to tell her sister Yvette that she and Riley would never be able to move in with them.
"I'm so sorry, sis, but you know what Walrus is like. I love him to bits. He's impossible, though. I can't lose him. But if you move in with us, that is what will ultimately happen. Walrus is a man of his word. If he says he'll leave me, he will. And he means the world to me, Yvette. I know he can be a cantankerous old sod, but I love him all the same, warts and all." "Don't worry, sis," Yvette had assured Leslie. "I'll be fine at the Col de Clare trailer park. It's not that bad, you know. I told you my trailer is not on top of everybody else's. It's private. I've been fortunate. Riley loves the field opposite our trailer with the ponies frolicking around there. No one else at the park has views like we do. It's not that bad a place to live. It could be a lot worse, you know. Of course it would be perfect if we were the only trailer home in the park, and we had more wholesome neighbours that didn't drink or do drugs. But it is what it is. You can't have everything, can you, Leslie?" Leslie had held her sister's hand tightly and given it an encouraging squeeze. "That's the spirit, Yvette. You're stronger than you look, girl. I'll help you as much as I can, and we'll make that trailer of yours absolutely beautiful." "You think we can make it beautiful? Somehow I doubt it." "Of course I do," Leslie had assured her. Leslie was a woman of her word. She had helped turn Yvette's rather lacklustre trailer home into a sumptuous cosy den, generously splashing out her hard-earned money in buying comfortable furnishings for the place. It looked incredibly good. It could have been in a magazine spread, and so even Riley had not been embarrassed or adverse to invite friends back home to play with her. Furthermore, their private trailer overlooked a field of ponies that Riley chose to adopt as her own. She'd often climb under the fence to stroke the ponies and give them apples. So when the ponies saw Riley coming, they would trot over to the fence. She had developed a good bond with the ponies and considered them in a funny way an extension of her own family. One of the people in the trailer park had a cat called Sylvester that spent half its time with Riley, adopting Yvette's daughter as his new best friend, and enjoying the plush comforts of the Wiseman trailer. Who says a cat doesn't know a good thing when they see it? On many nights, while Sylvette's owners thought the cat was painting the woodgroves red in his hot pursuit for rodents, he was in fact lying cuddled up in Riley's arms, blissfully fast asleep, digesting a full stomach of poached chicken. Leslie generously helped Yvette as much as she possibly could, occasionally dropping off shopping for her sister, insisting in giving her a few cash handouts, which made all the difference to Yvette's life. She'd often wondered how she'd have managed without her sister's kind intervention, especially now that her grandparents were no longer around. Yvette was rarely earning very little money, working as a waitress in town, and yes, life had been tough, but she believed she was a good mother, ensuring she gave Riley a wholesome upbringing, and she was doing the best she could waitressing to secure a living for them. She'd like to do so much more with her life, but with her limited education, her choices were few and far between. "Look, Miss Wiseman," said Dr. Finneason, "as I keep reiterating, this is not about you. I am not trying to find fault with you as a mother, which I believe you think I am. Far from it, in fact. However, Miss Wiseman, I am of the firm opinion that your daughter has been deeply traumatized, so I'm going to be referring her to a psychologist to get to the bottom of this problem. I will have to inform social services about your daughter's current condition, as they may feel the need to check up on your daughter's living arrangements at the Col de Clare trailer park, to feel fully satisfied that everything is well on the home front. If anyone came into my surgery, Miss Wiseman, presenting similar symptoms to your daughter's, I would need to do the same. It's just procedure. That's all it is. If I neglected to do this, I would be failing in my job and responsibility as a doctor." "I'm a good mother, Dr. Finneason. I don't need social services sniffing around me like a bad smell.
Those people are notorious for putting their noses where they don't belong, taking people's children away from them. You hear about it all the time, and it sucks. Do you know how many kids are messed up because of social services, Dr. Van Neeson? I've heard dreadful stories that would make your hair curl. There are 15-year-old kids out there who've run away from home because they've been abused by a foster parent. Some of them are now selling their bodies as a way of surviving and living on the streets. So I'm sorry, Dr. Van Neeson, but I have a very dim view of social services, and I think you should too.
I told you, Miss Wiseman, this is procedure. I have to follow it. It is not personal.
I'm sorry, Dr. Van Neeson, but it feels personal. I think you believe I'm an incompetent mother. I thought that from the moment I came into your surgery, the way you looked at me. And you think my daughter's condition is a result of something I did or did not do.
Miss Wiseman, did I say that? I never said that for a moment.
I assure you, Dr. Van Neeson, my daughter is well cared for. I may not live in an illustrious neighbourhood. I may not have a lot of money, but I would never abuse my daughter in any way, nor would I lash out at her. I'm an easy-going, well-tempered person. Furthermore, no one lives with me in the trailer. There isn't a man around anymore. I don't take drugs, nor do I smoke or drink. Are you happy now? As to why my daughter's not speaking, I do not know. But none of this is my fault. And why do I get the feeling the blame is conveniently being laid at my door? I knew coming here was a bad idea.
Don't get defensive, Miss Wiseman. I wouldn't be doing my duty if we didn't fully investigate the source of your daughter's trauma, which is deeply concerning. I am sure social services will be fully satisfied that all is well on the home front, so you need not worry about that. They are not so quick to take a child away from their mother, as you might believe. That is not what they would want. It is in their interest to keep families together. They fully appreciate the importance of children remaining with their birth parents. I think the sooner we get your daughter to see the psychologist, the better, Miss Wiseman, so that we can get to the bottom of what is irking her, to bring about this unfortunate condition. But I'm sure we will resolve this mystery in due course. In my experience, there is always a good explanation for everything.
When Yvette left the surgery that morning, she was holding her daughter's tiny hand in hers. She was feeling more than a little flustered. It felt as if her life had been put under a microscope, and that she hadn't come out of it smelling of roses. She sneakily suspected that Dr. Van Neeson probably thought she was a bad mother, even though he said he didn't feel that way about her. She resented the insinuations. She wasn't stupid. If social services were to do an investigation on her daughter's living arrangements, they were probably secretly checking up on her suitability as a mother. They'd be eager to see if she was hitched with some unsavoury character who was beating her up, or something. It was ridiculous. This whole wretched business was absolutely ridiculous. But at least she could tell that interfering busybody of a teacher, Julia Harris, that she had taken her daughter to the doctor. That would finally get that woman off her back for a while. "Come, let's go home," she told Riley, who obediently followed her to the second-hand Toyota that Yvette's sister had bought for her as a gift. "I wish you would speak, love," said Yvette, as she started up the engine. "Did you see the doctor? He thinks I'm a bad mother to you, because you're not talking. And your teacher is breathing down my neck like a dragon. I wish we could get past this, love," she said, reaching out to grab her daughter's hand. But Riley retracted her hand in disgusted revulsion, as if her mother's touch had physically burnt her. Yvette knew that her daughter's condition was all due to that insufferable man, Boris Mahoodle. So indirectly she was entirely to blame for her daughter's mute state. She had been responsible for bringing that man into their trailer home. If he had not moved in with them, she was certain things would never have panned out like this. Indeed, she knew that they wouldn't have. She had known letting a man move into her trailer had been a bad idea. But Boris, with his buttery, seductive words, had somehow melted away at her dogged resistance. She had agreed to finally let him move in, which on her part had been a catastrophic mistake. That was the problem with charming men like Boris, who treated you like a princess. It was almost impossible to refuse or resist their beguiling charms.
And with Boris being so easy on the eye, her protestations against this idea of his had dimmed. Before she knew it, Boris had almost become a fixture and fitting in their lives. She had met Boris Mahoodle while waitressing in town at the Gourmet Gallery. He had turned on the charm when she had taken his order that day. He'd got her full attention. He was ruggedly handsome, with a naughty, rather cheeky twinkle in his eyes that Yvette had found irresistible. She was not the type to be easily beguiled or seduced by a man. Boris had been different to other men that she had met. There had been a chemistry between the two of them that had been impossible to ignore, even though Yvette had really not wanted a man in her life to complicate things, especially as she wanted her prime focus to be directed on raising little Riley, as that was all that mattered in her life.
Yvette! Oh my goodness, you see that man over there, sitting at that table? He won't stop looking at you,
her waitressing companion Angelica had told her.
He's gorgeous! I mean, look at him! The man's ripped! I bet he spends all the time in the gym to be in such good shape. I told you, I'm not interested in getting involved with anyone,
Yvette had insisted, shrugging her shoulders disdainfully.
Besides, if he's a gym junkie, he's only interested in himself. I don't like vain men who know they're good-looking and think women will crumble at their knees just to look at them. I'm not like that. Besides, I don't want to get involved with anyone. It's just me and Riley, and I'm happy with that. Yes, I admit being a single mother is hard, but I'm making it work. Of course you're making it work, Yvette. You're a brilliant mother. Do you mind me asking, what happened to Riley's father? Why is he not around anymore? Asked Angelica, looking a little bashful, as this was a question she had longed to ask her good friend, but had failed to do so until now. You really want to know? Asked Yvette, straightening out her back. I dated Riley's father at school for many years. His name was Douglas Lagerford. I thought the two of us had something special between us back then. In those days we were inseparable. Even my mother thought it was a given that one day we would get married. So did my mother's parents, my grandparents, and even his parents thought so. I mean, I really liked him, and I've never felt for a man like I felt for him. We had such a great connection together. We'd talk about living together forever. In our minds, we never imagined ourselves ever living apart. When I fell pregnant with Riley, he left the sleepy little town like a bat out of hell. I think the word pregnant startled him half to death, like putting a snake in a chicken coop. I haven't heard a word from him ever since. I was 18 when I fell pregnant with Riley. Last I heard, he'd moved to Pennsylvania. I think he's married with a kid now. It sucks, but it is what it is. Well, he was young, wasn't he? You were both young back then, said Angelica. I mean, having a baby at 18, well, it's a big deal for both parties involved, you have to admit. Don't be too hard on him for being so rattled. Sometimes young people are frightened by pregnancy. I'm surprised he didn't ask you to get an abortion or something like that. I mean, at the very least, you should have discussed your pregnancy choices instead of him rushing off like that and disappearing into the sunset. I guess he was just terribly afraid of all the responsibility having a baby would entail. What did he say when you told him you had a bun in the oven? Well, when I told him I was pregnant, Douglas just didn't say a thing. I think he said, I need to think about this. And then he got into his car and drove away. I never ever saw him again after that. Even his parents lost contact with him for a while. But they never worried about him because he kept sending them postcards saying he was doing just fine. They couldn't understand why he up and left town like that. I never told them the truth. They didn't know I was pregnant with their son's child. I remember feeling so let down by Douglas, so surprised he would just run away like he did. It was so cowardice of him to do a thing like that. I knew I'd have to be a single mother like my mother had been with me, although in fact it was my grandparents that really raised me and my sister Leslie. Having said that, it seemed like I'm following the same path as my mother did. But I accepted my fate as you do. I didn't have a choice in the matter. I later learnt that Douglas had gone to university. I know he was very much against abortion. I think he knew my opinion on the matter, so that's why he did a runner. He knew I'd have the baby, and I guess he wasn't ready to settle down to be a father. That sucks, said Angelica sympathetically.
giving her friend an encouraging nudge. "No wonder you're reluctant to get involved with other men, Yvette. You've been seriously let down and abandoned by a close boyfriend when you were pregnant. You've lost your ability to trust a man, which stands to reason. No wonder you're apprehensive." "You're probably right. I hadn't thought of it like that. But I suppose I am carrying a few war wounds." "Of course I'm right, Yvette. When am I ever wrong about anything? You know what they say, once burned, twice shy. But not every man is built of the same stuff, Yvette. There's some seriously decent men out there who'd never abandon you if you were pregnant. Men are no different to women. You get good ones and bad ones. And every so often, when you have a rotten experience, you sabotage your future relationships, believing that all your other boyfriends are going to abandon you, just like Douglas did. That's why you keep pushing men away, Yvette." "I think you're in the wrong profession, Angelica. Why are you waitressing tables here at the Gourmet Gallery? You should be seeing clients, assessing all their emotional baggage and the problems they have," Yvette had teased. "You'd make a great psychologist. You figured me out perfectly." "I'm not just a pretty face," said Angelica, grinning from ear to ear. "But I'm being serious, Yvette. Look at that handsome man sitting over there, in your section. He keeps looking up at you. For all you know, he might be one of the good guys. Granted, he takes care of his body, but it doesn't mean he's obsessed. I say it's better he takes care of himself than not bother to bath for an entire month. You should let down your guard a little, Yvette, or you'll end up becoming a very sad, lonely old woman one day." "I suppose you're right, Angelica, but I'm hesitant of getting involved with anyone. I really am. It makes me very nervous and puts me on edge." "Oh my God, he's still looking at you, Yvette. Whoever he is, he fancies you rotten. I think he wants you to know it as well. He's no shrinking violet, is he? He couldn't be making his feelings more obvious. I told you I'm not interested. I've got Riley to think about." "I certainly don't want to serve him. Please will you do it for me?" "Tough titty, because it's your station. You have to serve him, Yvette," said Angelica, looking triumphant. "Please, Angelica, can't we swap stations? I'm being serious. I don't want to serve him. He might just eat me alive. Please don't throw me to the sharks." "No can do," said Angelica, chuckling. "Good luck with him. You're going to need it. He's absolutely drooling over you, Yvette, like maple syrup over fluffy pancakes. I'm glad I'm not wearing your shoes." Yvette had sashayed over to the table rather reluctantly, trying to appear as composed and unflustered as she possibly could, with her notepad and pen in hand, trying her level best not to give the man any eye contact. She didn't want to look into his lovely brown eyes. "Hello, sir. What can I get you?" she asked very professionally.
"What do you recommend?"
said the man, looking at the name on Yvette's lapel.
"What do you recommend, Yvette?"
"Well, it depends what you want, sir. The pork ribs are very tender. I do recommend them. The chef also does a very delicious barbecue platter, which he serves with mac and cheese, chicken wings, beef brisket, ribs, chips, garlic bread, and Caesar salad. That's a winner with most of us. Well, most of the people that come here, I mean."
"Well, the second option sounds irresistible. I am rather hungry. The name's Boris, by the way. Boris Mahoodle."
"It's nice to meet you, Boris. I haven't seen you around here before. Can I get you anything to drink? A craft beer, perhaps? We have a huge selection to choose from."
"How about you choose one for me?" said Boris, looking up at Yvette and meeting her gaze. "Somehow I've got a very good feeling, Yvette, that you've got very good taste. Has anyone told you you have the most beautiful blue eyes? I could lose myself in them."
Yvette raised a sardonic brow. "I bet you say that to all the girls, Boris."
"Actually, I don't," said Boris,
seemingly affronted by Yvette's insinuations.
"If I see something worthy of praise, I give it credit where credit is due. I don't make a habit of flattering people, just so you know. And you have very beautiful eyes, so don't let me take that away from what I'm saying to you."
"In that case, it's very nice of you to say so, Boris, but my eyes, as far as I'm concerned, are pretty ordinary."
"I think we can agree to disagree on that one, Yvette. You're a very beautiful woman, even if I say so myself."
Yvette took no notice of his compliments. She had seen it and heard it all before, so many times. But there was something about Boris that kept drawing her in, like a fish at the end of a fisherman's reel. When Boris was paying his bill, he left behind a very generous tip. He then slipped a note in Yvette's hand and walked away, making tracks back to a large black SUV. Yvette read the note and showed it to Angelica. It read, "I really like you, Yvette. If you fancy a drink sometime, please give me a call. I would love to hear from you. I'm not always in town. I'm a trucker by profession, but I will be passing through these parts on Friday. If you fancy a nice hearty meal and a drink, give me a call."
"I told you he really likes you," said Angelica. "He's a trucker, Yvette. Who would have ever thought he had time to work out like he does? The good news about truckers is you don't have to see him that often, Yvette. You can just date him from time to time. It doesn't have to be a serious relationship. Go on. It's about time you had some fun." It had been Angelica's persuasive suggestions that seeing a trucker was a win-win situation, because you could enjoy the occasional date and see them very fleetingly, that had made Yvette decide to see Boris again. However, once Yvette had started seeing Boris, things had grown pretty intense very fast, and even though he was out on the open road a lot, he soon moved in with Yvette. There was no doubt that Boris was a good man. He was incredibly kind towards little Riley when he moved in, and contributed financially to the food bills. He'd even paid for Yvette to receive a pampering at a local spa, and she had returned from her pampering looking like a movie star. So yes, things had been good with Boris around.
"Are you and Boris going to get married, Mummy?" Riley asked her, taking Yvette by surprise with her question.
"Why do you ask that, love?"
Yvette had asked.
"'Cause you're living together, and people who live together should always be married. Mrs. Harris at school says that if you live together without being married, it's a sin."
"Does she now?" said Yvette. "The Bible does say it's a sin. I will admit that."
"Then why do you do it, Mummy? 'Cause it's wrong, and if the Bible says it's wrong, it means it must be wrong."
"I know, love, but these days people all over the world live together before they get married. It's very common nowadays."
"But why do you disobey the Bible? It will make God very, very cross."
"I think people want to ensure they're compatible with their partner before they commit to spending the rest of their lives with each other. You see, there are lots of divorces around these days, more than ever before. You yourself know kids, Riley, at school whose parents are divorced, don't you?" Riley nodded.
"Yes, there are lots of people in my class whose parents are divorced, so they have to spend half the time with their mummy and half their time with their daddy."
"There you go, then. I don't want to make a mistake in a relationship, do I? I don't want to just marry, Boris without living with him first, because I don't want to end up getting divorced."
"But you love Boris, don't you, Mummy? So why don't you marry him, and then God will not be cross with you?"
Riley's questions threw Yvette a loop. If she was being completely honest with herself, she couldn't say she was in love with Boris. Yes, he was a nice man. Yes, he was attractive. Yes, he was kind. Yes, he was good to Riley. But she was a long way off from being in love with him. And so Riley was right. What was she doing living with him?
"Of course I like Boris very much, sweetheart. Otherwise he wouldn't be living in the trailer with us, would he?"
"Did you like Daddy as well?"
asked Riley.
"My real Daddy, I mean."
"You know I liked your dad, Riley. I loved him very much indeed. He was my first love. First loves are always very special. I told you when we got together we were young at the time. I was still at school, you know. When he heard I was pregnant with you, he got the shock of his life. He left town in a hurry. I think it scared him half to death to learn I was pregnant. I guess at the time he was too young to be a father. He was 18, you know. It was overwhelming for the both of us. But yes, I loved your father very much."
"Do you think he knows about me, Mummy?"
"Of course he knows about you, Riley. When he left me, he knew I was pregnant."
But then why doesn't he come back to see me? Because, love, I suspect he started a brand new life for himself far away from here. Do you think I will ever get to see him, Mummy? There's nothing stopping you from seeing him, love. One day when you're older you can look him up yourself. I'm quite sure he will be delighted to meet you. I really want to have a daddy. All my friends at schools have daddies, even their parents. Even if their parents are divorced, they have daddies.
I know, love. If it makes you feel any better, when I was your age, I was also raised without a father. So I know exactly how you feel. I'd go off to school every day, envying all the other children that had fathers. But you're lucky. At the very least, we know who your father is. And he's a very good man. That I can assure you of. One day you'll be able to locate him for yourself, and possibly have an ongoing friendship with him. That can never happen for me. I don't know who my father is, and I'll never know, and I'm all right with that. So is your Aunt Leslie. She's in exactly the same position as me, so you're not alone, love.
But that's so horrible,
said Riley sympathetically.
Not knowing who your daddy is, so you can never ever find him. I wish you'd marry Boris, Mum, so I can have a daddy. He's so nice. He likes you a lot. I know he does.
I will think about it, love. But marriage is a very big commitment, you know, said Yvette. In her heart she had no intention of marrying Boris, even though he'd asked her often enough, telling her they should go off to Vegas together and tie the knot. Whether he meant it or not, Yvette could not be sure, as he only ever brought up the subject when he was 2 sheets to the wind.
You know it makes sense, Yvette, he'd say. I love you, and I love Riley, like she's my own little girl. We can move to a nice place together, and you don't have to live in this trailer park. Think about it, love.
I'm sorry, Boris, but I can't, Yvette would often say. It's far too soon. Riley is everything to me, and any decision I make in my life has to concern her. She'll always come first, so I have to take things at a snail's pace to be sure where this is going. Boris had shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly.
Never mind, Yvette. We've got all the time in the world. As long as I'm with you, that's all that matters.
Yvette did not know enough about Boris as what you might consider reasonable in a relationship. She didn't know what he got up to on his truck stops when travelling over such long distances. You heard stories, didn't you, of truckers picking up women all the time for a night of passion, even if they had a wife and kids back at home. Many got lonely out on the open road and were looking for companionship. Boris wouldn't have any problems on that score, as women seemingly found him irresistible. He seemed to make sure he kept his body looking like the Michelangelo's David. Even though Boris was growing increasingly intense over their relationship, Yvette kept him warily at an arm's length away. She didn't really want to become too close with him. Something inside of her was pushing him away, as if she sensed something was off about Boris. It was not that she was afraid of being hurt by the man, but even after all these years she knew her heart still belonged to Douglas Lagerford, and that no other man could fill the void that her daughter's father had left behind. Douglas was Riley's father, and even though they had not seen each other in over 7 years, the connection was still there, even though it was probably rather faint by now, or more to the point, non-existent. But Yvette liked to believe that in some way she was still connected to Douglas. After all, they shared a daughter together. Beyond that, Yvette knew nothing about Boris. He was not forthcoming about his current life, and very evasive about the past, as if he had clandestine secrets that he was not willing to share, or more to the point, some skeletons in the cupboard. Everyone had a past. Yvette knew that well. She was not going to condemn Boris for that. Yvette had never squeezed him for more information about himself. She knew, of course, that he was raised in Denver by his 2 parents and had 3 sisters. Yvette had decided not to pry, because to be too interested in his past meant she'd get to know him more intimately, and she wanted to avoid that at all costs, so perhaps she was actually pushing him away. She kept any lingering questions or curiosities about him to a bare minimum, which he seemed to be grateful about, as if he really didn't want to share much with Yvette about himself. Once she asked him a little bit about his life in Denver, and he'd said, "I'd rather not go back to the past, Yvette. It's the future we need to focus on." And that had been that. Yvette had one big burgeoning regret, and that was having been persuaded by Boris to allow him to move into their trailer home with them. Riley was unfortunately becoming rather attached to the man, and this was something that worried Yvette. She knew if she broke up with Boris, it could potentially cause Riley great upset. In Yvette's heart, she could not see Boris and her settling down together permanently as man and wife. That would never happen, as when push came to shove, they didn't really have much in common with each other, and her interest in him was beginning to wane, rather like a polished piece of silver that suddenly loses all its gloss. Boris was a good man, of course he was. She had persuaded herself over and over again that this was the case, but there was something very wrong about their relationship, as if there was a gulf of secrets between the two of them. She was forever thankful that half the time Boris was not even at the trailer park. He was out and about on the open road, working as a trucker, ferrying cargo from one state to the next. And while he was away, Yvette almost felt as if she could breathe again. Despite Boris's busy life on the open road, he was constantly keeping tabs on Yvette, which she had found exceedingly annoying. He phoned her several times during the day, as if he didn't completely trust her, asking her probing questions like what she was doing at the moment, where was she? And this possessiveness was a new thing that she had noticed rising its ugly head in their relationship, and it was beginning to irk her. "What's that got to do with you, Boris?" she would say. "You sound as if you're checking up on me to see if I've been a good girl or not."
"There's no need to be like that, love," he'd said. "I know what men are like, that go to the gourmet gallery. I'm sure they have eyes on you. I need to ensure no one's looking at my girl, if you know what I mean. They need to understand you're mine. I don't want them getting any funny ideas."
As Yvette reflected on Dr. von Niesen's words, she knew what had triggered her daughter's trauma, and she laid the blame completely at Boris's door. He was entirely responsible for what had happened that night, and it was a night she would never forget in a hurry. This was all Boris's fault. The man was a complete buffoon, and even her sister Leslie had agreed with her on this one. "You're well rid of him, sis," she had said. "I knew the first time I laid eyes on him. He couldn't be trusted, sis. I've also noticed he's become very possessive over you of late, and I don't like that one bit. It's not a good sign to see these things in a relationship. It's a red flag, you know." Yvette had no way of knowing that it was on an unassuming, rather serene summer's evening, when Boris returned to the trailer park, after having been out on the open road for a few days, attending to his duties as a trucker, that all hell would break loose. In his hands he carried a bag loaded with groceries, and there was a big, contented, self-satisfied smile on his face that would have made a Cheshire cat feel rather ashamed. You would have expected Yvette to be pleased to see him, but she realized she was not. A small little voice was telling her to make the lumbering hulk of a man go away and leave her alone. Yvette realized she no longer even found Boris attractive, but she gave him a watery, insincere, welcome smile, as he had come home. What else could she do?
"Boris is back, Mummy,"
said Riley, running excitedly towards the man, with her tiny arms outstretched in an open hug. Boris dropped his groceries and lifted up little Riley in his arms, rocking her up and down, while Riley giggled with delight, tweaking his cheeks affectionately with her little fingers and looking straight into his warm brown eyes.
"So how are you, Riley? Have you been good for Mummy?"
"I'm always good, Boris," she had laughed. "Even the teachers at school say I'm good. I got 3 gold stars for my drawings and art."
"You're a very clever girl, Riley,"
said Boris, putting her gently down on the ground. Riley continued to run at his side like a devoted puppy dog, and then he warmly embraced Yvette, who was already retracting from the thought of his touch. Why had she got in so deep with this man, she wondered, trying her level best to pretend that she was happy to see him.
"I've missed you, love,"
he said, throwing his arms around her, kissing her affectionately on the cheeks.
"Have you missed me?"
He asked Yvette, whispering some sweet nothings into her ear, which were barely audible, and only served to tickle Yvette's ears. She inwardly grimaced, avoiding Boris's gaze. "Of course I've missed you," she lied. She was afraid he would see the treacherous insincerity in her eyes. If Boris picked up any aloofness on Yvette's part, he said nothing. Perhaps he was so caught up in himself he didn't recognize that the air around him had become significantly more hostile. He let out a contented chuckle.
"Well, you don't have to miss me any more. The next 3 days you've got me all to yourself. I'm not going anywhere."
His words made Yvette inwardly squirm. 3 days with Boris, living in their trailer home, was not a pleasant thought any more.
"Yippee!"
said Riley, throwing her arms up in the air in delight.
"Will you take me for ice cream tomorrow, Boris? Please say yes."
"I think that can be easily arranged," said Boris, giving Riley a wink. "I think you deserve a little spoiling. After all, you got 3 gold stars for art, didn't you?"
"I'm going to have the bubblegum ice cream. It's the very best. It turns my tongue bright blue."
In that sobering moment, Yvette realized things were so much nicer for her when Boris wasn't around. When he arrived on the scene, he took over everything, rather like a great big mackerel, being loaded and shoved into a tightly crammed tin of sardines, and squeezing everything else out of the way.
"I'm going to make a fire pit this evening," Boris told her. "We're going to have a lovely barbecue. I think it'll be fun under the stars, don't you? Do you want to help your mother make some salads for us, Riley?"
"I'm very good at making potato salad,"
Riley told Boris proudly. Yvette had watched Boris preparing a fire outside their trailer home. He laid down the firewood strategically. The smoke began to smoulder and spiral above the wood. Bright orange flames came to life, hungrily devouring it. Shortly afterward she smelt the sizzling meat on the grill that Boris was barbecuing. He was cooking sausages, burgers, pork and lamb chops. It smelt so delicious, and the lingering succulent spicy aromas permeated the woods. Yvette had made some garlic bread. Little Riley had made potato salad. They'd made French salad together and coleslaw, which she laid out on a rather rackety camping table, which she had covered with a blue and white gingham tablecloth. The table wobbled precariously when you helped yourself to salad. They had all sat out on flimsy camping chairs, under the stars to enjoy the Milky Way, spread out before them like an expanse of dark ribbon, studded with hundreds of sparkling rhinestone jewels. It was a beautiful evening. It was not too warm, nor was it too cold. The weather was as close to perfect as you could possibly get. Yvette was glad that they had one trailer home in the park that was completely isolated from all the other trailer homes, so that their barbecue would not bother any of their neighbours, or worse still, encourage them to join in on the feast. Yvette had paid the trailer park owner a little more for the privilege of having the trailer in this prime position. The extra rent money had been worth her while. Even now, as they sat there eating their food on paper plates, they could see under the soft prisms of moonlight stealing their way through the dark sky. A few ponies were grazing in the field opposite. Little Riley ran over to them to feed the apples that Boris had brought for her, returning with a bright smile on her face. She loved feeding the ponies.
"Mummy, the ponies love the apples," she said happily. "But the grey one is so greedy, he pushed the others away. He wants all the apples for himself. I'm going to call him Guts, 'cause he's a greedy, greedy Guts."
Yvette chuckled. "I think the name suits him well. Look, he's standing there, hoping you've got more apples for him."
"Sorry, Guts,"
said Riley, lifting up her arms as if to show him she had nothing left.
"No more apples tonight."
The pony hung around, chewing grass as close to the fence as possible, fixing his dark eyes on little Riley, as if sensing that maybe there were more apples on offer, if he hung around for long enough, that is. "So how was it out on the open road?" Yvette asked Boris, making an attempt to make polite conversation.
"Oh, you know, the usual. Always the same it is. Pretty mediocre,"
he said, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly, taking a big bite into a juicy hamburger, where some of the tomato ketchup and a few crumbs stuck to his lips, which he wiped away with the back of his hand.
This is very good, very tender. I mean the burger. Let me tell you, I know how to make a good one. Well, you know, love, how it is. There's nothing that's interesting about my job.
I don't believe that for a moment, said Yvette, nibbling into her lamb chop. This is delicious, by the way. Congratulations to the chef.
You don't believe what I've asked.
I'm insinuating nothing at all, Boris. I don't know where this is coming from. You're the one that's behaving strangely here, almost as if you've got something to hide. I'm just asking you a simple question about your trip on the open road, that's all.
You don't trust me, is that it, Yvette? Why don't you spell it out? Say it, why don't you?
Where is all this coming from, Boris? You've got to be in your bonnet about something. I was only politely asking you what your trip was like. You're reacting as if you're hiding something. Is there something you're not telling me, Boris? Is that what this is about?
So is this what you're intent on doing, Yvette? Henpecking me over our alfresco dinner tonight under the stars? On an idyllic evening like this? I don't need this. I've been out on the open road all day. I'm exhausted, deadbeat, tired. I come back home to be grilled along with the sausages, do I? Like I need this after the day I've had. I think I'm going to take a walk in the woodgrove, or I'm going to say something to you that I will regret.
Don't be like this, Boris. You're overreacting. I was not interrogating you. Go on, sit down. Try some of Riley's potato salad. It's very delicious.
I think I've lost my appetite, Yvette,
said Boris. He rose to his feet, and Yvette watched him, as with a torch in his hands he walked down a trail through the woods, angrily kicking up the leaves with his boots. The walk would probably do him some good, Yvette thought. He was behaving like a guilty man who had something to hide. Yvette really did not care. If he was cheating on her, it would be the perfect excuse to get him to leave her life. She liked the thought of that very much. Perhaps that was why she had asked him these questions. On a subconscious level, she was looking for an out. She had a sense there was a lot more to Boris and his secret life than she cared to even want to know.
What's wrong with Boris, Mummy? Why is he so cross?
Asked Riley in bewilderment. Grown-ups get cross from time to time, Riley. You must remember that Boris drives a truck for a living, and there are lots and lots of cars on the road. When he's out there driving, some of those cars do stupid things. So when he gets back home, he's tired after a long day, and little things can sometimes upset him. When people work too hard, little things can make you angry. But I'm sure when he comes back from his walk, he'll be in a better mood. Riley nodded, as if she perfectly understood.
Sometimes things make me cross too,
she admitted. Like what, Riley? Asked Yvette, raising her brow.
Well, Miss Harris at school asked me to draw a picture with a crayon. She said we could draw anything that we liked. And Claire Pompasson, well, she copied my picture that I was drawing. I drew a cat and a sun in a house, and she did exactly the same as me. I was upset. She copied my picture. I told her she copied me, and she said that I copied her.
Well, maybe she liked your picture so much she wanted to draw exactly the same as you. A while later, Boris came marching through the woods, but he was behaving peculiarly strangely. His feet were indignantly stamping the ground. He didn't even appear to notice Yvette or Riley, as he stormed right past them and walked straight into their trailer home, removing his hunting rifle. Yvette knew that Boris was a keen hunter. He'd gone hunting with his father from the age of 15, and had become passionate about the sport. Yvette wondered what the hell he was doing with his rifle. He couldn't go hunting on private property like this. Boris, what are you doing? It's illegal to go hunting here. I hope you're not planning to go shooting something.
I'm not going hunting, he said. I need to do something.
They watched him stomping into the woods. A while later, Yvette had heard a few gunshots going off, and she and Riley exchanged rather worried glances. Yvette shook her head. She felt furious because Boris was illegally hunting in the woods. She was not remotely impressed by his behaviour. "It ends now," she thought. "When he gets back from the woods with the rabbits he's killed, I'll tell him to leave. I've had enough of that man, and this is the straw that broke the camel's back." Boris was gone for so long that by the time he returned to their trailer home, both Riley and Yvette had cleaned up after the barbecue and returned to bed. Yvette could hear Boris climbing into bed next to her and letting out a huge sigh. Yvette had wanted to say something about his strange antics that evening, but exhaustion whisked her away from any desire to articulate her thoughts. All that could wait until the morning, she thought. It was a while later that all of a sudden Yvette woke with an alarmed start. It felt as if her whole trailer home was being hit by an earthquake. Everything began to shake and wobble precariously, and that was when she heard Riley scream. It was the scream that had made her blood turn cold. "Mummy! Mummy! Mummy! There's a face at the window! Somebody's over there!" Yvette, on hearing her daughter's frantic cries, had bounced out of bed and run to her daughter's side. She wrapped Riley in her arms. "It's all right, Riley. You've just had a bad nightmare, that's all," she said, trying to reassure her little girl. Riley's eyes grew round with terror. She pointed at the window, and Yvette saw it too, a huge face looking in directly at them, with yellow eyes. But when she looked again to direct her focus more intently, the strange anomaly had all but disappeared, and she wondered for a brief moment if she'd imagined what she'd seen. "You saw it too, didn't you, Mummy? The face at the window? I'm scared. It was looking in at me, Mummy." "It was nothing to worry about, love," said Yvette, trying to console her daughter, even though her reassurances were wearing thin. She knew she'd seen a face staring at them through the window with yellow eyes. It had been a human-looking face, but the details of the face were ambiguously obscure, given the moonlight was sparse. What on earth was going on, she wondered. It felt as if someone had launched an attack on their trailer home and was intent on scaring them half to death. Then it happened again. Their trailer home began to shake and wobble, and Riley let out a terrified scream. "It's going to hurt us, Mummy!" Yvette peered very cautiously outside the window, and what she saw made her heart frantically boom in her chest as her pulse began to race. There were 3 gigantic, dark, shadowy figures, shaking their trailer home so vigorously, as if they were irately angry about something. Yvette was certain her trailer home was going to collapse or just topple over. It felt as if they were on a boat out at sea, bracing stormy, very turbulent weather, and tempestuously wild, untamed waves that were rocking the boat vigorously. She couldn't work out what these obscure figures were, but she could hear their indignant grunts and growls. She caught the distinct silhouette of a pyramid-shaped head and a pair of humongous-sized shoulders. And then she realized that these creatures rocking her trailer from side to side and banging on the walls with their powerful fists were 3 Bigfoot. That was when she saw Boris charging towards the door of the trailer, with a resolute determination on his face, holding the rifle in his hands. "Right, I've had enough," he snorted. "You want a fight? You've got one. I'm not scared of you." "What is going on, Boris? What's going on out there?" Boris ignored Yvette's pleas. The door to the trailer just flew open. Both Yvette, with her daughter at her side, saw the 3 Bigfoots standing side by side together, as Boris began to indiscriminately shoot at them. What the hell did Boris think he was doing, Yvette wondered. Of all the stupid, insane things to do, this took the cookie right out of the jar. "Stop it, Boris, for goodness sake!" Yvette cried out. "What are you doing? Don't hurt those Bigfoots or they will kill you!" Boris refused to listen. He seemed caught up in his own little world. But every bullet he fired missed the Bigfoots. They seemed to just bounce out of the way. "Damn!" said Boris. "Why am I not getting any of them?" "Stop this at once, Boris! Come inside!" came Yvette's demanding voice. What happened next was so fast, it was probably faster than a blink of an eyelash. A lofty Bigfoot that Yvette believed was between 9 to 10 foot tall fearlessly charged towards Boris, grabbing him by the hand thunderously and throwing him off balance so he toppled precariously to the ground, landing very hard. Yvette had heard a forceful popping sound, almost as if Boris's leg had just snapped. The Bigfoot grabbed Boris's rifle from his hands, breaking it into many pieces, throwing it around the place so it landed in the long grass, like flying pieces of shrapnel from a war zone. The expression on his face was of disgusted revulsion. He growled contemptuously and stood over Boris's body, leering down at him. He said something to Boris in a strange language that Yvette did not understand.
Malikaswa, hikalinatola, hikasipava.
Yvette was expecting the Bigfoot to kill Boris. The other Bigfoot shouted something as well, but she couldn't understand what they were saying, nor could she even help Boris. She stood helplessly by her daughter's side, frozen to the spot. Seconds later, the Bigfoots glanced up at her, turned around and glided away, as if they hoped that they'd got their message across. Yvette felt they were saying, "Leave us alone, and we'll leave you alone. Don't mess with us." Yvette suddenly realized what this was about. She suspected that while Boris had been shooting earlier on in the evening, it had been at the Bigfoot, and now here they were, extracting their revenge. Boris was an ignoramus, she thought. He was lucky not to be dead. The first thought that entered her mind was, "You stupid, stupid man." She hurriedly charged over to Boris, dropping to the ground, and asked him if he was all right, although her compassion towards him was dwindling fast and was in very short supply.
Of course I'm not bloody all right, woman. Look at me. Look what that Bigfoot did to my leg. You better call an ambulance at once. I'm bloody hurt. My leg is killing me. He's broken some bones, let me tell you. Don't you dare tell anybody it was a Bigfoot that attacked me. They'll think you've lost your marbles.
"Don't worry, I won't say anything," said Yvette. Yvette called an ambulance. She sat down beside Boris to try and comfort him, but he seemed irate.
I tried to kill the Bigfoot. That's why I came back to the trailer earlier on in the evening when we were having the barbecue, because I saw a Bigfoot, and I came back. I tried to kill him with my damn bullets, but I missed. He came back with reinforcements to attack us. Those things all need bullets directly in their head.
"You tried to shoot at a Bigfoot that was doing nothing to you?" asked Yvette. "What do you think you were doing?"
I told you, woman. I was trying to kill the Bigfoot I saw in the woods.
"And he was doing nothing to you, but you still wanted to kill him. Are you insane? I don't care how good a shot you are, Boris. You are no match for those Bigfoots. Tonight we were woken up by 3 rampaging Bigfoot. They were furiously angry because of what you did. And you know what? I don't blame them one bit. I thought my heart was going to jump out of my chest. The way I see it, Boris, is you're very lucky to be alive. Those things could have killed you. But they had compassion to spare your life when you had no compassion on theirs. If I had been that Bigfoot, I'm not sure I'd have been merciful or forgiving on you. You pushed them too far. Was it any wonder they came back to make a statement?"
He told me he'd kill me next time if I did this again, said Boris, when he stood over me. That's what he said. Can you believe that? He actually spoke to me in my head.
"I can believe that. He seemed very intelligent. He spoke in a language. You don't shoot at something that's intelligent, that's human-like. And that creature was so human it was unbelievable. What do you think you were doing?"
When I first saw the Bigfoot in the woods, he was looking at me. I went to get my rifle. He was still there. I couldn't believe my luck. It was almost like he was waiting for me. I thought he'd be an easy trophy, didn't I? When I shot at him, he bounced out of the way. I thought I heard him say, "What the hell are you doing? I wasn't going to hurt you." But I kept shooting at him anyway, and then he vanished like a ghost. I had no idea where he went, but I wasn't to know they were going to come back.
What I believe is that you're lucky, Boris, to be alive. That's all I can say. And I'm not remotely surprised he came back to our trailer to let us know who's boss around here. I can't believe you did this, Boris. You should know better. I thought you were an intelligent man, but now that's questionable. I mean, what you did was naively ignorant and presumptuously arrogant. Yvette had not been excited about visiting Boris in hospital, where it appeared he had fractured a few bones when he'd been flung to the ground, but he was recovering well.
When the doctors asked him what had happened, he'd said he couldn't remember, but had sustained a nasty fall. Yvette's daughter Riley had stopped speaking after the event with the Bigfoots. It had rattled her so much, and this was all Boris's fault. Yvette had sent her daughter to stay with her sister Leslie for a few days, as Riley was far too scared to sleep in her own room in the trailer, as she was afraid the thing with the big face and yellow eyes would come back. When she had told her sister what had happened, Leslie said one thing: "You need to end it with Boris. I'm sorry you do. The man's not right in the head. He put you and Riley in mortal danger with his outrageous behaviour. He should have left those Bigfoot alone, especially given the creatures were minding their own business and imposed absolutely no threat. Imagine if you went out shopping and someone tried to shoot you. You'd want to go after them, wouldn't you? To have them arrested for trying to hurt you. That man of yours goes blindly charging after the Bigfoot like a great big buffoon. What was he thinking? He was asking for trouble. I'm not remotely surprised the Bigfoot came back with reinforcements. But I am surprised that Boris is alive. I'd have thought they'd have finished him off after the stunt he pulled. I'm worried about Riley, Leslie. She hasn't spoken since the incident. She's traumatized after seeing that face at the window, and can you blame her? That must have been terrifying for a 7-year-old girl. And then she saw the Bigfoot throwing Boris to the ground. Do you think we're safe living here after what happened? Yes, I do. The creatures are clearly intelligent. They didn't kill Boris, did they? They warned him off. You yourself said they spoke to Boris in his head, saying next time he wouldn't be so lucky. It shows you that they're thinkers. If you're a thinker, you don't just randomly kill anything for no reason at all. And if they'd wanted to kill Boris, they could have easily done so. That speaks volumes as far as I'm concerned. They know you and your daughter had absolutely nothing to do with the unfortunate event. So they targeted Boris, not you or Riley. I guess they want to be left alone. And if I know Boris, he will try to go after them again, especially now that he's been injured, as I'm sure he'll want revenge. There's no stopping some people, and that includes Boris. I think he's got a big ego on him, sis. Well, he's not going to have an opportunity to harm those Bigfoot, because I'm done with him. Leslie looked heartily relieved. Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that, Yvette. I've never liked Boris one bit. I know he's good-looking and seemingly charming on the surface, but something's going on there. Let's just say I think he's a man nursing many secrets. You're not wrong there, sis. That's what I've thought all along. When Yvette arrived at the hospital with a bag of grapes in a brown paper bag, along with a man's health magazine that she knew that Boris would like, she had in mind to tell Boris that once he was discharged from the hospital, that it was over between the two of them. She was rather apprehensive about how he was going to react to being dumped, as Boris had quite the ego on him. She tentatively entered the lift until she reached the 2nd floor, and rather hesitantly made her way to the ward, passing the nursing station, where the nurses assured her that Boris was indeed receiving visitors, and was up and about doing rather well, although literally contained in bed, as he couldn't exactly move around, given the condition of his legs. Leslie peered through the ward. She observed a woman with 2 children standing over Boris's bed. The woman was holding Boris's hand, stroking his hair tenderly away from his face. Her behaviour was over-familiar, but she was too young to be Boris's mother. So who was she? Could she be one of Boris's 3 sisters? Yvette was not sure that she was. She overheard the woman talking very, very gently to Boris. You poor, poor thing, darling. I can't believe this happened to you. How on earth did you break your leg? You took quite the tumble, didn't you? I told you, love. I can't remember, said Boris, looking very sorry for himself. I just recall falling. That was it. Is Daddy going to be all right? Said the little boy, looking very concerned. Yvette could not believe what she had heard. It felt she was intruding on a family scene. In a moment of unbridled confidence, she trotted over to Boris's bed, with a large, friendly smile on her face. It gave her a measure of rather smug satisfaction to see his skin drain of all its colour when he saw her. What are you doing here? He asked almost accusingly.
his face growing as red as a field of poppies. "Who are you?" asked the woman, looking up at Yvette, who was holding the brown paper bag of grapes in her hands, along with the rolled-up magazine, which she presented to Boris. "I'm Yvette, and who are you?" "I'm Boris's wife. Boris has never mentioned an Yvette to me before. How do you know my husband?" Yvette could see that Boris was physically squirming. He was looking at her pleadingly, as if to say, "Don't tell her, please, please don't tell her who you are." "I'm just the doctor around here," said Yvette, choosing to lie for reasons she couldn't even explain. Maybe she didn't want to hurt the kids in Boris's family by revealing to them the bitter truth of who she actually was. "Oh, it's a relief to be able to speak to a doctor finally," said the woman. "I'm so sorry I didn't realize you were the doctor, but you weren't wearing a white coat. I've been wondering when I could speak to someone about my husband's condition. I'm terribly worried about Boris. I've no idea what really happened to him, and neither does he. But he's injured his leg rather badly. Very bad break, I believe it was. I'm concerned because he travels long distance by truck, hauling freight. Will he be all right to resume his job?" "Boris is going to be fine. I'm sure he'll be able to resume his job once he's back on his feet. He did very well in the operation, you'll be glad to know." "But how long will that be?" asked Boris's wife. "It's very important, doctor. My husband earns a living as a trucker. He can't afford to have his job compromised. I'm sure you appreciate that." "Of course I understand, ma'am." Yvette thought about her leg when she'd broken it and said, "I'd say about 6 weeks or so." "Well, I suppose that's not too bad. He can recuperate at home once he's discharged from the hospital. Thank you, doctor." Yvette gave Boris a wink and smiled at both Boris's wife and their 2 children. And she said, "The main thing is he's going to be fine." "I'd better be doing my rounds now," said Yvette. "I must go." Yvette practically skipped out of the hospital, knowing in her heart she would never see Boris again, and it felt as if a heavy load had been lifted off her life. She had known in her heart she couldn't trust the man, and now he had no excuse to come crawling back to their trailer home. Because he wasn't stupid. He knew Yvette would never take him back, now that she knew he was a married man. Besides, he was physically incapacitated at the moment, and would have to physically recover at home, with his wife and his 2 children. She had received a message from him on her cell phone, saying thanks and I'm sorry. It had taken Yvette a couple of weeks to persuade her daughter that the horrifying events of the night, when she'd seen a Bigfoot's face at the window, were never ever going to be repeated again. "Riley," said Yvette, taking her daughter lovingly in her arms, "I need you to listen to me, love. Boris did a very stupid thing when he was living with us. He went into the woods and tried to kill a Bigfoot with his rifle. You can see how intimidating and big those things are. The Bigfoot was grievously upset with Boris and came back with reinforcement in the form of 2 friends to shake our mobile home to get his message across. He was grievously upset, and you saw his face at the window looking in at you. And that was very scary. I know it was. Then you saw the Bigfoot throwing Boris to the ground. And, of course, Boris broke his leg. But he's recovering very well. He did that to Boris because he was angry. Wouldn't you be angry if someone tried to hurt you?" Riley seemed to think about this for a moment, and she nodded, but she remained as mute as ever. "Well, there you go, then. The Bigfoot did break some of Boris's bones, but it didn't kill him, did he? That Bigfoot could have killed Boris, but he didn't. So we have nothing to fear. Do you understand?" Riley nodded. "Oh, Riley, I do wish you would speak, love. I really do. I don't understand why you still don't say a single word. But anyway, the Bigfoots are like us, aren't they? They're not going to hurt us without very good reason. We're safe living here. You've been gone for 2 weeks, and while you've been staying with your Aunt Leslie, nothing untoward has happened here. Everything has been very quiet and peaceful at the trailer park.
The trailer has not rocked or anything. Those Bigfoots want to live in peace, and if we respect that, they'll respect us in turn. Do you understand, Riley?"
Riley nodded again.
"I know you like Boris, love, and it is upsetting that he's not coming back. I made a very big mistake asking him to live with us. He had secrets, you see, love. He's married and he has 2 children. When I went to the hospital, I met them all. He lied to us. He wasn't a single man. We could never have got married, but I wouldn't have married him anyway."
Riley's eyes grew round. Tears spilled down her cheeks.
"I'm sorry, love. I know it's dreadfully upsetting for you. You really loved Boris, didn't you? And you fancied him as a father. But it is what it is."
Yvette could have sheltered her daughter from the truth. But what was the point? In her experience, it was a whole lot better to be honest with your children. But the dreadful reality was that after the inauspicious event, Riley appeared to have lost the ability to speak. It would seem Dr. Finneason was sure that Riley had been traumatized. But there was no way on God's earth that Yvette would reveal to the doctor what had happened that night. If she related her unlikely story to him, he'd probably think she belonged in a loony bin. Yvette knew very well there were some things you did not share. In the weeks that followed, the social services visited the trailer home, sniffing over her like a cadaver dog over a dead body, and asking her hundreds of invasive questions. The doctors had found nothing physically wrong with Riley to explain her muteness. Every week she was seeing a psychologist, but it would seem no one could get to the bottom of why Riley was no longer talking. Riley's account. I am 20 years old now, but like many people, when I look back on my life as a 7-year-old girl, I don't remember terribly much. However, there is one big exception to that rule. I do recall the bodeful events that traumatized me so much that I lost the ability to speak and was mute for several months. I believe no matter how young you are, if you're exposed to a traumatic event of any kind, you will not forget that experience in a hurry. It leaves behind its cloyingly indelible scars that are as hard to shake off as the fleas off a dog's coat. Growing up, my mother did not have much money, but she worked incredibly hard for a living, and we had a great life together. She was a selfless, sacrificial person who put me over and above everything else in her life. She would always tell me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her, even though I was an unexpected surprise that she had never seen coming. I knew from an early age that my father, who'd been my mother's first love, had abandoned her when she became pregnant with me. My mother said he was young at the time, and having a child at his age would have scared him half to death, so he ran away from our sleepy little town. I would often lie in bed longingly and say, "Dad, where are you? Please don't forget about me." But I was sure he'd never hear my pleas. I so wanted to be like the other children at school and have a father. I think when my mother began to date Boris, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel, a glimmer of hope, I suspect. I knew that if they both got married, I would be like all the other children at school and also have a father. At 7 years old, that was what I wanted more than anything else in the entire world. When I sent off my request to Santa Claus every year, it was always a wish to have a father. I wasn't interested in a brand new doll or a pretty Cinderella dress. All I wanted was a father, nothing more and nothing less. When Boris moved into our trailer, I was as pleased as Punch. I thought it must mean that my mother was very serious about the relationship, for she had never made a habit of bringing men home with her. When I asked her if she was going to marry Boris, I could see she didn't want to, so I felt bitterly disappointed. I genuinely liked Boris. He'd give me piggyback rides, play hide-and-seek with me, buy me nice things. Sometimes I even pretended he was my father. Boris was never around much. He was a trucker. My mother would say he was out on the open road hauling freight to different states. But whenever he came home to the trailer, I always was pleased to see him. As a 7-year-old child, I never ever compared myself to the more privileged kids who came from wealthier backgrounds than I did, or who lived in better homes than me. I never considered such things as desperately important. I genuinely believed that I had life very good, and that I wasn't deluding myself, because I really did. If you're a frog that grows up in a small pond all your life, and you've never been in a large pond before, why would you be sad about your circumstances when you feel safe and secure exactly where you are? My mother worked hard for a living, waiting tables at the Gourmet Gallery. We never wanted for anything. Our trailer was sumptuously cosy. It was also freshly painted on the outside, as my Aunt Leslie kept it in pristine condition for us. She spent a lot of money on our trailer, turning it into an enviable little home, which even my friends thought was incredibly cool. Aunt Leslie would say that you could create beauty in small spaces, and she was not wrong about that. Our trailer was located in the sequestered part of the park, overlooking a farmer's field of ponies, and opposite a heavily wooded area consisting of tall, lofty trees. The woods belonged to the owner of the trailer park, Mr. Bob Farble, who had hinted that one day the land would be bulldozed to make way for a housing development, from which he claimed he'd make his vast fortune. And when that happened, we'd all have to say goodbye to our trailer homes. I think Mr. Bob Farble was all talk and no action. He was one of those people. I'm glad to say that his ambitions never occurred. I suspect they were rather muted. And even though the trailer park no longer exists today, the land remains beautifully preserved and unspoilt. Every morning I would feel like I was on holiday. I would wake up surrounded by such incredible beauty, as there were so many indigenous wild animals that would frolic happily around the property, and being an animal lover, I thoroughly enjoyed watching the cute little visitors that would scamper around, from foxes to rabbits, deer, and even mountain lions. On one occasion a mountain lion and her 2 cubs were playing around our trailer home, and I watched them for many hours. I was never afraid. They were incredibly beautiful. I felt privileged to grow up in this part of the world. I knew some of the other trailers at the park were dilapidated, run down and in pretty bleak condition. And there were, of course, unsavoury characters living in some of those trailers, who drank to excess, smoked weed and took drugs. But I never hung around them. Sometimes they could be rather rowdy, and there were times on the wind I would hear drunken laughter or people having a slanging match together, calling each other rather gross, unsavoury names. We were very lucky to have our trailer cocooned so far away from the other residents that it was like we lived a world away from everyone. It had been my mother's ingenious idea to ask Mr. Bob Farble for our trailer to be located opposite the field of ponies, and against all the odds, with a slight increase in our rent, he had agreed to her request. So my mother lived by the age-old adage, if you don't ask, you don't get, and she was absolutely right. I do, however, think Bob Farble had a soft spot for my mother. He could see she was a single working mum who didn't drink, smoke or do drugs, so I think he went out of his way to help her. My mother believed he just liked the extra rent, but I begged to differ. I remember one man living at the trailer park. When he was drunk, he kept beating up his wife. She'd go to hospital regularly, pretending she'd walked into the door, but I doubt anyone believed her claims. People aren't stupid, you know. Everyone knew exactly what was going on in her trailer, and I could never comprehend why the wife didn't leave the husband. But my mother would always say that maybe she didn't have anywhere else to go. When she said that, I felt incredibly sorry for the woman, having to live with her abuser, and never knowing when her husband was going to bite her head off next. On several occasions the police were called around to the property. I preferred to stay well away from people like that, living in the other trailers, to distance myself from them. So I would play with myself in the woods, and from a very early age I always felt as if I was being watched. I would tell myself I was imagining things, of course, that there was nobody there, but the feeling of being watched always persisted. I had heard strange sounds in the woods at times, chattering in a peculiar language that I could not discern, whistling, grunting, and wood-knocking. But being so young and impressionable, I just brushed those experiences away, as if they were a few hairs on a winter coat. One evening Boris returned home, with a big bag of groceries in his hands, and a huge smile on his face. He'd been out on the open road and was exhausted, and very wary from the long journey. He told us he was going to spend the next 3 days with us. He began to prepare a barbecue, so we could enjoy eating our food under the stars. I was thrilled at this suggestion, as everything eaten out of doors and cooked over open flames tastes so much better. I eagerly set to work preparing some salads, my speciality being potato salad, which is always very creamy, so my mother let me make it with the cold potato pieces in the fridge. It was the best feeling in the world, sitting under the gilded canopy of the showy stars on a rather tenebrific but warm summer's night, surrounded by the delicious smells of our barbecue. I was famished. The delicious smells the barbecue was giving off had whetted my appetite, and I got my fingers all covered in gummy goo as I began to eat my chops with my fingers. In the beginning my mother was talking to Boris, asking him some questions about his day out on the road. Something she said really upset him, as he quickly got up from his camping chair, grabbed a torch and barged off into the woodgrove, saying he was going to take a walk. It was the first and last time I saw Boris angry. It upset me to see him so mad. When he returned from his walk, me and my mother were finishing our meal, but Boris failed to acknowledge us. Instead, he barged right past us, as if we weren't even there. I don't think he was deliberately ignoring us. It was almost like he was cocooned in his own little world, and he almost forgot that we existed in it. Moments later, Boris left the trailer, moving very fast. He'd retrieved his rifle and headed straight back into the woods. My mother was livid. She knew that even though it was illegal, Boris had obviously decided to go hunting. I think she thought it was his way of letting off steam after the argument they had had. He probably needed some space to cool down. Maybe hunting was an outlet for him, to distract himself from thinking too much. But he was not supposed to be doing it on Bob Farble's property. We thought he might be hunting raccoons, or even rabbits. We couldn't be sure. But the expression on his face seemed to say that he meant business. I was upset that Boris would kill anything. I loved animals myself, and hated the thought of them being killed, which made me a bit of a hypocrite, as I seriously love red meat. But I prefer not to know where it comes from, because if I do, I might not be able to eat it. Shortly after Boris had sauntered into the woodgrove, we heard gunshots going off in the woods. My mother said out loud to me, "Right, that's it. I've had enough of that man. It's over between us." It really scared me to hear my mother talk like that. I knew she was going to end her relationship with Boris. I did not want that to happen. Boris was the nearest thing I'd had to a father. It was with a heavy heart and with low spirits I reluctantly returned to bed that night, certain that by the morning Boris would be gone from our lives. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. All of a sudden I heard muted voices. A conversation was going on outside our trailer. It sounded as if 3 people were having a long discussion together in a foreign language. Someone was out there, I thought. I wondered if someone from the trailer park was hanging outside our home. I sat up in bed with a start. The whole trailer began to shake and wobble, and that was when I saw the face at the window, with bright yellow eyes staring in at me. I was so terrified that my entire body convulsed. According to my mother, I screamed, but I have no memory of that at all. All I could recall was the haunting face at my window, staring in at me. That I could never forget. Once again the trailer began to wobble and shake precariously. I truly thought it was going to topple over on its side. I heard Boris yelling something. I think he said something like, "This stops right now. I'm coming after you." He was furious. He got his rifle and charged out of the trailer door. We followed close behind, watching what he was going to do. There was a wall of 3 Bigfoots standing side by side, their eyes clearly focused on us. These things were so terrifying. They were like giants. They made me feel like an ant in their midst. I got the impression that the Bigfoots had banged on our trailer to make us come out. They wanted us to know what Boris had done, randomly firing shots at one of the Bigfoots earlier on in the evening in the woods, and they wanted us to know it was not acceptable behaviour. My mother later told me what he'd done. I don't know what on earth was wrong with Boris, but he was absolutely fixated on those Bigfoots. I mean, he paid no heed or attention to any common sense whatsoever. I was 7 years old, and even at that tender young age, I knew we were no match for those Bigfoots. Boris began shooting indiscriminately at them from the front door of our trailer, almost as if he was clay pigeon shooting. It was absolutely ridiculous. My mother tried to stop him, of course she did, but he refused to listen to a word she was saying. She was shouting at the top of her lungs, "Stop! They're going to kill us, Boris! You've got to stop! Stop, Boris!" The Bigfoots were not remotely afraid. I mean, why would they be? We were nothing to them. We were tiny in their sight. They stood perfectly still, nimbly bouncing out of the way of any moving bullets, as if they could accurately predict the trajectory. Their reaction time was so fast. I was incredibly impressed because I'd never seen anything like it before. Boris was an excellent shot, but his bullets made him look like he'd never fired a shot a day in his life. He looked like a novice at the sport. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. I felt certain that the Bigfoots were going to kill us. Boris had tried to take them out. Now they wanted revenge. I was sure of it. I remember a Herculean-sized Bigfoot lunging towards Boris, grabbing him by a powerful arm. I closed my eyes. I was terrified about what was going to happen next. He was so close to Boris that when I opened my eyes, I noticed his burning eyes were blazing with indignation. But even though he was angry, he seemed to be in full control of his emotions, which Boris was not. I watched as his massive, powerful hands, with fingers the size of sausages, effortlessly broke Boris's rifle, throwing it on the ground, where it was buried in the long grass. Now we were all completely helpless, at the mercy of 3 powerful Bigfoots, fully aware of our own vulnerability, knowing full well that within the next few seconds we might be obliterated from the face of the earth, to be remembered no more. Even at 7, in those vital seconds, I knew death was imminent. I often wondered why we did not run back into our trailer home, shut the door behind us, bolting it after us, calling for help, but we did none of those things. It was like we were frozen in time-space, like 2 figures on a Monopoly board, waiting to see what would happen next at the throw of a dice. Seconds seemed like hours, as the Bigfoot threw Boris on the ground. I heard a loud snapping sound. Boris was wincing in pain, clutching his leg, looking up at the Bigfoot with absolutely terrified eyes. I think he thought he was a dead man. I thought he was too, as did my mother, and that ultimately we would be next. But nothing happened in the way that we'd envisaged. The male Bigfoot with his powerful tree-trunk-sized legs stood over Boris, looking down at him. He appeared to be saying something to him, without any audible words, but what he was saying was a dialogue that happened between only Boris and the Bigfoot. I'm sure the Bigfoot was telling him telepathically not to mess with him. Seconds later, as if nothing had happened, those 3 Bigfoots glided away, and that was that. My mother immediately went over to help Boris, who was swearing furiously. My mother kept telling him he was lucky to be alive, and he should thank God he had not been finished off by that powerful Bigfoot. "You could have been killed. You're very lucky he didn't kill you. He showed mercy on you, Boris. If I'd been him, I'm not sure I would." I could see my mother's attitude towards Boris had shifted exponentially. I knew unequivocally that once he was ferried off to hospital, I would never see him again. I was to later learn that Boris was living a double life. It would seem he had a wife and kids. He wanted to have his cake and eat it. When I heard about his treachery, I didn't feel sad he'd left our lives after all. I felt as betrayed as my mother did. My mother would say that she was glad Boris was no longer around, but there were moments when I believed she was lonely. I knew the setback with Boris would likely put Mum off men for the rest of her life, so the hopes of having a father grew increasingly dim for me. "I'm not going to be taken for a mug again," my mother would say. "I knew that man was living a secret life. I should never have got involved with him. Why did I listen to Angelica?" It was after that terrifying event I became mute. My mother sent me to doctors, We had social services visiting our home, asking my mother a plethora of awkward questions. I went to see a specialist for a physical evaluation, and when they found nothing physically wrong with me, I was then referred to a psychologist. But despite all my lengthy sessions with her, I remained steadfastly mute. But all that changed when Eleanor Parkins came to stay with me. Eleanor Parkins was not like me in any way. Her parents were reasonably wealthy, and I'm not sure her mother was remotely impressed that her 8-year-old daughter had gravitated towards the likes of me. I know she tried to get her daughter to befriend the richer kids at school, but her efforts failed, as kids tend to choose their own friends for themselves, with or without their parents' approval. Eleanor was a feisty little girl, with a bright, sharp mind of her own, and she was mulishly stubborn as well. If you told her the sky was red, and she believed it was blue, there was no talking her around. When Eleanor decided I was to be her best friend, even though I was mute, there was not much her parents could do about the problem. They couldn't stop her from making her own choices. "Riley's my best friend. I don't want to play with other kids," she would say. "I want to play with Riley." I remember it was over a long weekend that her parents were going away. Eleanor begged her mother to let her stay with me. At first her mother said no, but then she decided to pay the Calder Clare trailer park a visit. It was when she visited my mother's pristine trailer that overlooked the field of ponies and had tea with my mother. She finally agreed to let Eleanor stay with me. She told Eleanor she believed my mother was a very capable woman, and the trailer was in impeccable condition, that she felt safe leaving Eleanor in my mother's charge, although I dare say she had a rather grim view of the other occupants in the trailer park. The great thing about Eleanor was she accepted my muteness without any questions. But then that's kids for you, isn't it? They're so much more accepting of strange things than adults are. The kids at school simply believed I didn't care to talk, and they accepted that, as if it was the most normal and natural thing in the entire world. They'd say things like, "Riley doesn't like to talk, she likes to be quiet." I couldn't believe my luck when Eleanor came to stay with me. I'd always fancied a sister, and for the next 3 days I could pretend we were family. I wanted to make sure that Eleanor would come back and stay with me again. So me and my mother had to show her a great time, so she'd have many more sleepovers at our home. "I can't believe my mummy said I could stay here," said Eleanor. "She was going to say no when she saw the other trailers in the park. But when she saw yours, she changed her mind because your trailer is so nice." I do remember when Eleanor stayed at our trailer for the first day. We would spend ages in the fields together, with the ponies. One of the grooms who looked after the ponies would always smile at me warmly and greet me. On several occasions, he'd give me a ride on one of the ponies, leading it around the field with me on its back. The groom's name was Lincoln. He had been working for the rancher Bill Murray for over 10 years, and was previously from Arizona. He assured me that Bill Murray did not mind me attending to his ponies, because the man loved children. When Lincoln saw me in the field with Eleanor, stroking the ponies together, he took us for a ride. We both were delighted. We sat on the same pony together, and Lincoln led us around the field. Later we fed the ponies with a huge box of apples that Eleanor had brought. My favourite pony was a greedy mare I called Gutsy, as she always wanted all the apples. But her real name was Pleiades, which I was told was one of the planets in our star system. The owner of all the horses was fixated about stars, so all of his ponies were named after stars in the night sky. When I look back at those happy days, I smile, because Eleanor came from an opulent lifestyle, where she had so much. But that girl genuinely envied me. She thought I was the one who had life so good, living in an open space, in what she described as a cushy den, surrounded by a field and trees. In her eyes, I was the one with the greatest riches. It's amazing how different you see things through a child's eyes. I believed she was right. In my opinion, I was a millionaire, because it's not just money that makes you rich. It was on the second day that Eleanor persuaded me to play hide-and-seek in the woods with her. A year had gone by since the grisly incident with Boris and the Bigfoots, but I was still mute, and not even the psychologists could find out why I was like this. but it was agreed that I'd undergone some kind of trauma. Since then I'd never been into the woodgrove on my own, but my friend's enthusiasm was infectious, and I didn't want to disappoint her, even though I was terribly afraid of going into the woods. I just nodded my head in agreement. Little did I know that going into the woods would change my life and bring a happy smile back to my mother's face and reassurance to the concerns of many of my teachers. But to the kids, I would be like the little girl that didn't want to talk, who just changed her mind. I do vividly remember it was summer. I can even recall what I was wearing, a pretty sundress. The weather was fine, the sky as blue as a cornflower. The lofty trees in the grove were bedecked with their leafy splendour, covered in lush foliage. We were lucky. The owner of the property who owned the trailer park lived on this land, further away in a big farmhouse that was tucked neatly away against some undulating foothills. The property boasted ponds, streams and creeks. The owner of the trailer park, for some reason, kept the paths in the woodgrove clear to create riding trails for his family to use, and so the paths through the trees were pretty clear and rather useful for us. On occasion I had seen riders trekking through the woods, but all was quiet on this unassuming morning. I was a tad apprehensive, I don't mind admitting, especially when we first entered the woods. I kept thinking of the large face with the yellow eyes staring at me from the window. Was the owner of those eyes in the woods now, I wondered? My nervousness soon dissipated, as Eleanor's enthusiasm became infectious.
Oh, it's so cool in here! You're so lucky to have woods on your property. I'll count, and then you can hide.
In earnest, we began our game of hide-and-seek, and once again the feeling of being watched overcame me. When it was my second turn to begin hiding again, Eleanor began counting.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That was when I saw a dark figure moving towards me. I was about to scream, but the figure indicated for me to be quiet. I was staring at a female Bigfoot. She was looking at me with dark, shining eyes, and I heard her saying in my head, "I'll show you where you can hide, and your friend won't find you." She beckoned for me to hide between two halves of the tree, and began to arrange some leafy foliage around me so that I could not be easily detected. All the while she chuckled, her eyes meeting mine. I began to giggle as well. In that moment, I realized I'd been afraid of nothing. The Bigfoots really did not mean us any harm. It was Boris who had provoked them to anger, and rightly so. This female Bigfoot was helping me hide from my friend, and my heart swelled with pride.
I'm coming now, whether you're ready or not,
came Eleanor's voice. She began frantically searching for me, and was growing increasingly frustrated when she couldn't find me. I heard the female Bigfoot chuckle. In the end, my friend gave up.
I can't find you anywhere. Where are you? This is getting boring. I can't find you.
I'm over here, I said, revealing to her my hiding place. Eleanor was more than a little nonplussed. She wrinkled her brow as she frowned.
How did you manage to cover yourself with all that foliage?
She asked. To her amazement, I actually answered her.
Wouldn't you like to know?
I teased. Eleanor's mouth dropped open.
You're speaking, Riley! You're speaking!
As we walked away from the woods, I glanced over my shoulders, and the female Bigfoot was standing by the trees nodding at me. I remember feeling so happy that she was my friend. I do vividly recall that this was a year of many miracles, starting from when I was able to speak again, and everything else in my life began to change. One day a large red Toyota Cruiser drove up to our trailer. A handsome-looking man climbed out of his car. Even though I'd never seen him before a day in my life, he looked somewhat familiar to me, as if I knew him in some way. I ran over to him to ask him who he was, as my mother was not expecting any guests. The young man was looking around rather nervously. He asked me if my mother was around.
"I'm an old friend of your mother's," he told me. "I haven't seen her in a while. Is she around?"
"I'll go and get her for you,"
I told him. I ran into the trailer,
Mummy, you have a visitor.
Who is it? She asked.
I don't know. He says he's an old friend of yours.
An old friend? Said my mother, ambling over to the trailer door. When my mother saw the man standing outside our trailer, I was shocked, as her face drained of all its colour, growing as white as a piece of paper. She kept opening and closing her mouth rather like a startled goldfish, and then she said,
Douglas, is that really you? What on earth are you doing here? You're the last person I expected to see.
I've been a bloody fool, Yvette. Such a fool. What can I say? Can you forgive me for running off all those years ago?
For a while my mother said absolutely nothing, but a sorry tear spilled down her cheek.
Of course I forgive you, she whispered. There's nothing to forgive. We were young. It was understandable. You had a dreadful shock.
I was an idiot, said Douglas. An absolute idiot. There is no excuse for the way I behaved. I can't believe you didn't even come after me. Most women would have come after me for money, but you never did.
The next thing I knew, they were embracing. Tears were shed. My mother took Douglas into the woods for a walk. I heard her saying,
But I thought you were married and you had kids.
In response, he chuckled.
Are you kidding? You know you were always the love of my life. I just haven't had the courage to come back for you after what I did. I was such a coward running off like that. But I was so afraid when you announced you were pregnant. I couldn't handle it. It was overwhelming for me. Recently I told my mother that the baby that you had is her grandchild. She was horrified with what I'd done. She was the one that encouraged me to have the nerve to come back and see you after all this time. And I'm so glad I did.
When my mother came back from her walk with Douglas in the woods, they were holding hands. My mother had a smile on her face so large, I was actually surprised it fit on her face.
We've something to tell you, love, she said, smiling at me. This is your father, Douglas Lagerford.
And what is your name?
Douglas asked me.
My name is Riley. Are you really my daddy?
I'm really your daddy.
You're not going to leave us, are you?
My father held me very lovingly in his arms. He bobbed me up and down on his knees, and he said,
No, I'm never leaving you again.
And he was true to his word. Me and my mother moved back with him to Philadelphia. My mother married Douglas, and I had a very happy childhood, being raised by such beloved parents, but I never ever forgot my remarkable experience with the Bigfoots in the woods. The trailer park, the Calder trailer park that is, no longer exists today. But it still exists in my mind, for I have never forgotten those Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.